It was the summer of 1934 when the mountain air of the Savoy carried with it the last breath of Marie Curie. Within the walls of the sanatorium at Passy, she lay upon pale sheets that rustled faintly when the nurses moved them, her body thin and fragile after a lifetime of labor in unseen forces. The air was quiet, broken only by the sound of the wind passing through pine branches outside the window. She closed her eyes and surrendered, leaving behind discoveries that altered the very fabric of human understanding. Welcome, dear listener, to this gathering of memory. I invite you to share where and when you are listening so that we may form a circle across time and space, a web of remembrance that stretches wider than nations. If you wish to walk with me further along these paths of history, press the mark of subscription and let us begin. Warsaw in the year 1867 was a city under occupation, a place where the Polish tongue whispered in kitchens and courtyards, but bowed in public to the Russian overseer. The streets were narrow and often dark, the lamps struggling against winters that seemed longer than elsewhere, as though time itself was weighed down by chains. In this city, under such skies, a child was born on the 7th day of November into the household of the Skłodowski family. They named her Maria, though in years to come, the world would remember her as Marie Curie. Her father, Władysław, carried within him the old dignity of a teacher. He instructed mathematics and physics, though much of the equipment once entrusted to his school had been stripped away by officials and sent elsewhere. What remained in his possession were broken instruments, a barometer that no longer held its glass, a compass that trembled and stuttered rather than pointing steady to the north, coils and lenses gathered in drawers. To his children, these remnants were treasures, the bones of knowledge. He would open them at night and show how even a fragment could still reveal the hidden laws of the universe. Maria's mother, Bronisława, possessed a quiet sternness, her life marked by the weight of responsibilities and the shadow of illness. She governed the household with discipline, yet her strength waned year by year, the cough deepening until it became an echo through the corridors of their home. Maria, still so young, watched the fragility of her mother's frame and did not yet grasp how absence can linger long before death itself arrives. In 1878, when Maria was 10 years of age, her mother passed away, leaving an emptiness that no instrument, no lesson could ever fill. The house grew quieter, though not in peace. It was the silence of grief, and it carved itself into Maria like a line etched deep into glass. Children often carry sorrows differently than adults. Some bend beneath the weight, while others sharpen themselves against it. Maria seemed to choose the latter path. In her notebooks, she filled pages with exercises beyond her years, numbers and formulas forming not only solutions, but escapes, gateways into a world less cruel than the one outside. Her father encouraged this with patience, even when food was scarce, even when warmth came only from thin fires during the Polish winter. Knowledge became the currency of survival, and Maria hoarded it with a hunger sharper than any she felt in her stomach. The Warsaw of her childhood was not merely occupied, but suffocated. The Russian authorities sought to erase Polish identity through language, suppressing education that did not conform to their dictates. Yet the people resisted quietly, invisibly. They formed networks of hidden schools, whispers passed through families. It was in these spaces, where young men and women gathered behind closed doors, that Maria's early defiance took shape. She joined circles of clandestine study, reading forbidden texts by candlelight, tracing the outlines of revolutions of thought that had long been declared dangerous. The air in those rooms was heavy with smoke and secrecy, and perhaps also with the fragrance of ink freshly pressed onto worn paper. Yet even brilliance could not shield her from the limits of her gender. Women in that time were not admitted into higher learning in Poland. The gates of universities remained closed to them, guarded not by walls but by convention. For Maria, it was not enough to accept this fate. She dreamed of distant halls where lectures were open to those who had the will, regardless of sex. That dream was not yet Paris, not yet the Sorbonne, but it stirred quietly each night when she closed her eyes. At 14, she faced another trial. Her elder sister, Zofia, contracted typhus and died suddenly, leaving Maria again to walk among shadows. Two women she loved, gone before their time. Some lives begin with abundance, but hers began with subtraction, as though the world insisted on chiseling away her attachments until only resolve remained. She grew serious, reserved, less inclined to games of childhood. It was said by some who knew her then that she carried herself with an unusual gravity, as though already conversing with forces invisible to others. Her father's employment faltered, his teaching positions reduced under Russian scrutiny. The family descended further into financial hardship. Maria worked as a governess for wealthier households, hiding her brilliance under the veil of necessity. She cared for other children while hungering for the books she could not yet afford. In quiet hours, she devoured works of literature and science alike, teaching herself from fragments, piecing together a self-education like a quilt stitched from scraps. But this life, though heavy, was not without its sparks of imagination. She would walk the streets of Warsaw at dusk, the cobblestones gleaming after rain, and wonder whether the universe itself was composed of such hidden streets, unknown yet waiting to be revealed. She believed that nature, too, had secrets that only patience and sacrifice could uncover. Did she sense then, as a young girl, the luminous particles of radium that would one day glow in her laboratory? Or was the vision not yet formed, only a yearning without shape? We cannot know. Yet the seed was there, carried silently within her, waiting for the soil of another country to take root. It was in these years that her sister Bronisława, called Bronia, conceived the idea of studying medicine in Paris. The sisters struck a pact. Maria would labor as a governess, sending wages to support Bronia's education. Later, Bronia would provide shelter for Maria to pursue her own studies abroad. Such a promise was not made lightly, for it meant years of sacrifice and uncertainty. Yet Maria accepted, for the thought of one day entering the great halls of learning was worth any patience, any deprivation. There is something haunting in the thought of her nights during this time. A young woman in a foreign household teaching children not her own, sitting by the dim flame of an oil lamp with borrowed books spread before her. Outside, the wind carried the distant sounds of Warsaw, sometimes the laughter of passers-by, sometimes the heavy boots of soldiers. Inside, her mind reached far beyond the confines of her room, reaching toward stars of knowledge not yet visible. The years passed, each marked by letters exchanged with Bronia in Paris. Those letters carried hope across borders, their paper worn with folding and refolding. And always, Maria saved her wages, counting each coin as if it were a stepping stone across a river. She knew one day she must cross. The train that finally bore her away from Warsaw seemed less a machine of iron than a vessel of fate. As its wheels turned, the rhythm echoed like a heartbeat, faster and stronger with each passing mile. She looked through the window as the Polish fields slipped into distance, carrying with them childhood sorrows, yet also the memory of a mother's absence, a sister's death, and the secret hunger for truths forbidden in her homeland. Ahead lay Paris, where lights burned differently, where knowledge did not whisper but proclaimed itself openly in lecture halls. Ahead lay the life of Marie Curie, though she was still Maria then, stepping across the threshold of destiny. The train vanished into the night, its sound fading like a lullaby carried into silence. And in that silence, she dreamed of the city that awaited her, of books, of experiments, of a new beginning. The train wheels that had carried her away from Warsaw did not simply deliver her to a city, they brought her into another world. Paris, when Maria Skłodowska arrived in 1891, was unlike anything she had known. The air itself seemed different, filled with a restless energy, a mix of coal smoke and perfume, the scent of books from riverside stalls, roasted chestnuts on corners, and the faint metallic tang from the endless machinery of modern life. The streets were wide, the boulevards illuminated by gaslight, and the very stones seemed to hum with a confidence forbidden in her homeland. Yet though the city brimmed with grandeur, she found herself entering it not as one of its children, but as a stranger who would have to carve her place inch by inch. The attic where she first lived was narrow and cold, a room barely larger than the bed it contained. The walls were thin, the wind from the Seine slipping in through the cracks, gnawing at her nights with chill. There was no stove to warm her, and so she wrapped herself in every layer of clothing she owned, yet still she trembled. Meals were sparse, often little more than bread and tea, sometimes nothing at all. Hunger, sharp and unrelenting, became a companion she carried into the lecture halls. But she endured, for to be hungry in Paris while seated among books and teachers was, for her, still a kind of victory. At the Sorbonne, she sat among men who doubted her presence, though few spoke it aloud. The ceilings of the great amphitheaters soared above her, echoing with voices of professors who spoke with authority over mathematics and physics, names of laws and principles flowing like rivers of light. She drank it in with a thirst that could not be quenched, writing furiously into notebooks, her hand cramping from the effort but never pausing. Each equation seemed to her not merely an arrangement of symbols, but a window into the invisible skeleton of the universe. She carried within her the memory of Warsaw's secret classrooms, and now, surrounded by the very bastion of knowledge that had once been forbidden, she vowed to absorb all it offered. But still, there was loneliness. She walked the Paris streets after lectures with her head bowed, too poor to join the cafes, too foreign to be welcomed into the laughter of groups. Sometimes she paused at the bridges, watching the river carry away the light of the city in its dark current. Did she wonder then if she belonged? Did she question whether the sacrifices, the years of labor as a governess, the hunger in her belly, were enough to sustain her here? Perhaps. Yet she pressed forward, for doubt was never allowed to anchor her long. The flying University of Warsaw had taught her resilience, a quiet defiance against authority. Now the Sorbonne demanded something different: endurance. The exams were merciless, the professors indifferent. The ranks of students thinned each year as many fell away under the weight of expectations. But Maria, with her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, endured. When others faltered, she persisted, her notebooks swelling with the evidence of her discipline. She graduated first in her class in physics, then later pursued mathematics with equal resolve. To those who noticed, she seemed a figure of contradiction, frail, quiet, and yet driven by a force that could not be measured. Her life in Paris was not only of study, it was also of survival. On some evenings, she took small jobs tutoring children of wealthy families, her accent reminding her always of her foreignness. She saved every franc, still loyal to her pact with her sister Branya, who by then was working as a doctor in Paris. Branya offered her support, but Maria was reluctant to lean too heavily, priding herself on independence. She walked great distances to save the fare of trams, endured cold to save coal, and ate little to preserve her coins for books. Each sacrifice was not an end in itself, but a stone laid on the path toward discovery. It was during these years that the friendships she formed were sparse but deep. Fellow students recalled her seriousness, the way she seemed to vanish into thought even when sitting among others. There was little room in her life for frivolity, yet in her quiet way, she observed the world around her with intensity. The Paris she saw was not only a city of lights, but a city of contrasts. the wealth of boulevards alongside the poverty of alleys, the grandeur of science alongside the fragility of those who pursued it. She began to sense that knowledge, while beautiful, was not untouched by the sufferings of the body. There is a haunting beauty in imagining her solitary meals, when she might have peeled an apple slowly, slicing it into thin fragments, each bite delayed, stretching the meal to last an hour, or in picturing her bent over a book while the candle burned low, her breath forming a mist in the frigid air of her attic. She was not yet Marie Curie, celebrated scientist, Nobel laureate, icon of perseverance. She was only Maria, a young woman in exile, sustained by the fire of unseen possibilities. And yet, even in exile, destiny drew nearer. Her studies led her beyond the lecture halls into laboratories, where the smell of chemicals clung to the walls and the air shimmered with heat from flames beneath glassware. Here, she felt most alive, her hands steady as they measured, mixed, and observed. The fragments of broken instruments from her childhood were replaced with real tools, though even these were modest compared to the grandeur of her ambitions. What mattered was not the perfection of equipment, but the sharpness of her mind, which could see connections where others saw only confusion. She had not yet met Pierre Curie, not yet glimpsed the man who would become her partner in both science and life. But already, in those years of solitude, she was preparing herself for the partnership. To meet him as an equal, she needed first to forge herself in solitude, to test her strength against hunger, cold, and doubt. And so, her life in Paris, though harsh, was a kind of furnace in which she tempered herself into the steel she would later require. At night, when she finally lay upon her narrow bed, her body aching from long hours, perhaps she let herself dream of what lay ahead. Did she see the glow of radium before it was discovered? Did she sense that her name, unknown and foreign in that city, would one day be carved into the memory of nations? Or did she dream simply of rest, of her mother's lost voice, of the fields of Poland fading in the distance? Dreams, like discoveries, are rarely simple. The seasons turned. Winter gave way to spring, spring to summer, and the city bloomed with festivals and music. Maria remained constant, her gaze fixed upon her studies, yet the city was not blind to her. Slowly, professors began to note her brilliance, though they did so with caution, wary of praising a woman too openly. Among students, she became a quiet figure of respect, her name whispered in tones of admiration. She was not loud, not flamboyant, but she was undeniable. And so, the girl from Warsaw, who had once studied in secret classrooms, found herself at the threshold of a new life. She had endured the hunger of the body, the loneliness of exile, the indifference of professors, and still she stood. The train that had carried her into Paris had left behind the echo of wheels, and now those echoes transformed into footsteps, steady and deliberate, carrying her toward a future that glowed faintly, like a hidden ember waiting to ignite. One evening, as the lamps of the city flickered against the dark, she closed her books and walked across the Seine. The water reflected the lights like broken stars, and in that reflection, perhaps, she saw her own journey, fragmented, difficult, yet luminous. She lingered for a moment, listening to the distant hum of the city, before returning to her attic, where new letters from Bronya awaited her. Among those letters, an introduction to a man was soon to be written, a man named Pierre Curie. The candle burned low. The room grew colder, and Maria, already exhausted, allowed herself to fall into sleep, unaware that the next chapter of her life would bring not only companionship, but discoveries that would burn through the very fabric of the world. The candle that had burned low in her attic room flickered into the darkness, leaving behind the faint scent of wax. From that same flame, another light was kindled in the days that followed, though she did not yet know it. For among the letters that reached her small dwelling was one that would alter her path, carrying with it the name of a man whose life, like hers, was already bent toward the mysteries of matter unseen. His name was Pierre Curie. When she first met him, it was not in a hall of grandeur, but in the quieter spaces of Parisian scientific circles, where conversations rose gently above the clatter of glassware and the shuffle of notebooks. Pierre was a man already seasoned by years of research, though still young in age. His eyes, deep and earnest, carried the gravity of someone more attuned to the invisible than the visible. He was not a man of polished charm, nor of worldly ambition. Rather, he seemed to exist half in this world and half in another, drawn always toward questions of magnetism, crystals, and forces that could not be grasped by hand. Maria, still new to the city, observed him with the same attentiveness she gave to her studies. She noticed his simplicity, the way he dressed without care for appearances, his thin frame bent slightly as though shaped by the hours at his desk, and he noticed her as well, the intensity of her silence, the way her mind seemed to rest not on the chatter of voices, but on the deeper current of inquiry. Their recognition of one another was not immediate thunder, but the slow unfolding of two rivers meeting, their waters merging until they became inseparable. At first, their connection was practical. She needed laboratory space for her research. He, already established, offered assistance. Together, they began to work, and in that work they discovered not only compatibility of mind, but a resonance of spirit. Long hours were spent in laboratories that smelled of dust and heat, where the light caught on the rims of beakers and the air quivered with the hum of experiment. The clatter of tools, the scratch of pens across paper, the soft murmur of exchanged observations, these became the language of their bond. Paris outside bustled with carriages and music halls, the laughter of cafes, and the movement of politics that surged with each new season. But within their shared space, time seemed to stand still. They spoke not of fashions or gossip, but of currents, fields, and forces. They dreamed not of wealth, but of truths, hidden in the heart of matter. In this way, their companionship deepened, not through romance at first, but through the sacred rhythm of shared pursuit. Yet Pierre was a man of feeling as well as science, though his feelings were expressed with restraint. He found in Maria not merely a colleague, but a soul who understood him in ways others could not. And Maria, cautious yet steadfast, felt in him a steady presence, unlike the storms of uncertainty that had marked her earlier years. Still, she hesitated. When Pierre spoke of marriage, she reminded him that her future might not lie in France at all, but perhaps back in Poland, where her heart still held ties of loyalty. She did not wish to bind him to uncertainty. His reply was patient yet firm. If she must return to Poland, he told her, then he would follow, for his work and his life were now bound with hers. Such devotion startled her, for it was rare to hear in those days, rarer still from a man of science who might have chosen a quieter path alone. In his words, she recognized something greater than sentiment. She recognized a commitment to walk beside her, not only in life, but in the pursuit of truth. And so, in 1895, they were married. Their wedding was simple, stripped of all ornament. There was no lavish gown, no grand procession. Instead, they celebrated by riding bicycles together through the French countryside, the air fresh upon their faces, the wheels spinning in rhythm like the great wheels of destiny that had carried her from Warsaw to Paris. Their union was not forged in pomp, but in simplicity, in the quiet joy of companionship and discovery. Their home became both sanctuary and workshop. Instruments, notes, and books crowded the rooms as though the very walls bent under the weight of their investigations. The line between life and work blurred until it nearly disappeared, for both were dedicated to the same pursuit. When others might have dined in salons or sought leisure in gardens, they remained bent over experiments, chasing faint signals of energy that the world had barely begun to suspect. It is worth pausing to reflect on the nature of such a partnership. Many unions are forged in passion, others in convenience, but theirs was forged in inquiry. They were not merely companions of heart, but companions of the mind. Their devotion expressed through hours of labor side by side, through discoveries written into notebooks, smudged with dust and fatigue. And yet, within this labor, there was tenderness. In the sharing of a flask, in the passing of an instrument, in the silence of thought broken only by the murmur of agreement, love was expressed in its purest form, unadorned, unspoken, yet undeniable. The city of Paris might not have noticed them at first, for they did not seek notice. They were two quiet figures, moving between home and laboratory, their footsteps echoing on cobblestones that carried countless others. But in time, the world would come to know their names, for the path they had begun together led into the heart of forces more luminous, more dangerous than either could yet imagine. One evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops of Paris, their small laboratory was filled with the glow of oil lamps. Papers lay scattered across the tables, covered in calculations and sketches. Pierre leaned over a notebook, his brow furrowed, while Maria measured carefully from a beaker, her hands steady despite the fatigue of the day. In that quiet moment, neither could know that their work would one day reshape medicine, warfare, and the very understanding of matter itself. All they knew was the joy of pursuit, the humble satisfaction of labor shared. The candle in her attic room had burned down long ago, replaced now by the steady flame of partnership. And in that flame something new was kindling, faint yet unmistakable. Glass vials on their shelves shimmered faintly in the dark, their contents alive with a strange, unearthly glow. The world outside had no name for this yet, but soon it would. The night deepened, and in the silence of their home, the faint radiance lingered, bathing the room in light. Not of fire, not of oil, but of something stranger, something born from the very bones of matter. They did not yet know the cost nor the toll it would exact. They only knew that they had found the doorway to a hidden world, and together they would step through it. The faint radiance that lingered in their laboratory was not the warm glow of fire, nor the steady flame of lamps, but a shimmer that seemed to arise from the heart of matter itself. It was quiet, unassuming, almost ghostly, and yet to Marie and Pierre it was more beautiful than gold. This glow was not yet understood, not yet named in the language of triumph, but it was already shaping their days and nights, binding their marriage to a pursuit that would not release them. Their life together was one of modesty, almost austerity, yet beneath its plainness lay a richness unknown to most. They did not surround themselves with ornaments or seek the company of salons. Their wedding had been marked not by banquets, but by bicycles, their wheels turning in rhythm through the countryside, a journey of air and freedom. They carried that same spirit into their marriage. Their furniture was sparse, their meals simple, their pleasures quiet. Yet within the walls of their home, books and instruments multiplied until they seemed to crowd the very air, for their life was not measured by possessions, but by the steady accumulation of knowledge. Pierre, with his quiet intensity, and Marie, with her unyielding focus, created a partnership unlike many before them. In the evenings, when others might have spoken of society or ambition, they spoke instead of experiments and ideas. Their conversations were not always lofty. Sometimes they were as practical as how best to construct an apparatus or where to find chemicals they could scarcely afford. Yet within the humblest of these discussions lay the heartbeat of discovery. For both of them, Marriage was not a separation from their work, but an extension of it. The laboratory in which they labored was far from the gleaming halls of modern science. It was little more than a converted shed, damp and drafty, with a roof that let in rain and walls that seemed too thin to hold the magnitude of their ambition. The air was often heavy with dust, the floor stained from countless mixtures, the benches cluttered with jars, flasks, and tools in constant use. In winter, the cold gnawed at their fingers. In summer, the heat stifled their breath. And yet within that shed, a revolution was being born. Day after day, they worked side by side, bent over furnaces and vessels, their clothes covered in soot, their hands calloused by labor. Their pursuit was relentless, and often it was thankless. For hours they would stir boiling mixtures, lifting heavy containers of pitchblende, breaking it down bit by bit, searching for the faint signals of substances hidden within. The work was not elegant. It was grueling, monotonous, and exhausting, requiring not only intellect, but physical endurance. Yet Marie accepted this without hesitation, as though her entire life had prepared her for such sacrifice. She had endured hunger and cold in Warsaw, loneliness in Paris, and now she endured this, the weight of labor unending, because she believed the hidden world was worth it. It was in these moments that the intimacy of their partnership revealed itself most clearly. The passing of a tool, the exchange of a glance, the shared silence after hours of fruitless work. All of these became expressions of love more profound than words. Their devotion was not separate from their experiments. It was woven into them. Each discovery, each small success, was not merely scientific but personal, a testament to their bond. And yet, for all their devotion, the outside world remained distant, almost indifferent. Paris moved on in its rhythm of politics, art, and spectacle, unaware of the quiet struggle within that shed. The newspapers spoke of wars and scandals, of inventions and entertainments, but they did not speak of Marie and Pierre. They were two figures hidden away, laboring in obscurity, their names not yet uttered in salons or academies. Perhaps this anonymity was a gift, allowing them to work without intrusion. Or perhaps it was another form of trial, demanding that they continue with no promise of recognition. But in the evenings, when they stepped away from the laboratory, they allowed themselves brief escapes. They would ride their bicycles through the outskirts of the city, the wind carrying away the fatigue of the day. They would sit in quiet fields, gazing at the horizon, speaking little, for words were not always needed. In those moments, the world seemed to expand again, reminding them that life was not only labor, but also the rhythm of breath, the turning of seasons, the simplicity of companionship. There is something poignant in the image of Marie, still slender and frail from years of deprivation, pedaling beside Pierre along dusty paths, her hair loosened by the wind, her face lit by rare joy. For all her seriousness, she was capable of delight, and in Pierre's presence, she found space to express it. He gave her not only partnership in science, but also the freedom to be fully herself, unguarded, unashamed, alive. Their work, however, never truly left them. Even on such excursions, their minds turned back to the strange glow of their samples, the measurements that hinted at energies beyond comprehension. They spoke of the possibility that matter itself contained reservoirs of power, that the atom was not indivisible, but alive with hidden currents. These ideas were dangerous, not in the sense of scandal, but in the sense of shaking the very foundations of accepted science. Yet they pursued them quietly, without boasting, for they believed truth needed no embellishment. The years unfolded with this rhythm. Labor in the shed, bicycles through the countryside, evenings of discussion, nights of fatigue. Slowly their work began to attract notice. A paper published, a lecture delivered, murmurs of interest among colleagues. Still, recognition came slowly, grudgingly, especially to Marie, who was often overshadowed by the traditions of her time. Yet Pierre, unwavering, insisted always that her name be joined with his, that their discoveries be seen as shared. In this, too, he was her partner, protecting her right to stand beside him in a world that often tried to push women into the shadows. But beyond recognition, beyond papers and lectures, what mattered most to them was the work itself. The strange glow of radium, faint and ethereal, became the axis around which their lives revolved. It was a light unlike any they had seen before, a light that seemed to come not from fire or electricity, but from the very bones of the earth. They marveled at it, unaware that its beauty carried danger, unaware that the glow they cherished would one day claim their health and their lives. One evening, as the laboratory grew quiet and the lamps were extinguished, a vial left on the table shimmered softly in the dark. Its glow was pale, steady, almost holy, illuminating the outlines of the room even as the night pressed against the windows. Marie and Pierre stood together, watching in silence. The glow seemed to them a promise, a sign that their years of toil had not been in vain. They could not know that it was also a warning, a harbinger of suffering yet to come. For now, they only felt wonder. The vial's light lingered, bathing their faces in a radiance that belonged neither to night nor to day. And in that quiet, it seemed as though the universe itself had opened a doorway for them, inviting them deeper into its mysteries. They stepped away only when fatigue forced them, leaving the vial to glow alone, a silent sentinel of what lay ahead. The vial glowed softly in the dark, casting its pale light across the rough walls of the shed that served as their laboratory. It was a fragile flame, steady and silent, yet unlike any other light humanity had ever known. Fire consumes, lamps flicker, electricity hums, but this glow seemed to emanate from the very bones of matter, a light that asked for no fuel and showed no fatigue. To Marie and Pierre, it was a promise, a doorway into mysteries deeper than they had dared to imagine. Yet as they lingered near its radiance, as they bent their bodies day after day toward its secret, the unseen cost was already seeping into their flesh, quiet and merciless. The work required to coax that glow into being was nothing short of Herculean. Tons of pitchblende, the heavy ore sent from distant mines, arrived in carts that creaked beneath their burden. Each sack had to be lifted, each fragment broken down, crushed, boiled, dissolved, and separated. The air of the shed thickened with fumes. The walls bore the stains of chemicals. The floor became slick with residue. Their hands grew raw from the handling of acids, their lungs filled with the acrid bite of vapors, their backs bent beneath the endless labor. This was not the refined image of science often painted in portraits. It was toil, brutal and exhausting, more akin to the work of miners than of scholars. Marie, slender and small, bore this labor with a tenacity that astonished those who glimpsed it. She stirred heavy cauldrons of boiling liquid, lifted containers that seemed far beyond her strength, and stood for hours in the damp chill of the shed, her clothes soaked, her skin burned by contact with corrosive substances. And yet she persevered, as if her very body were a tool forged for endurance. She did not shrink from the discomfort, nor from the exhaustion. Perhaps she believed, as she had since childhood, that suffering was the inevitable cost of truth. Pierre, too, bent himself to the work, though he often urged her to spare her body. But Marie was not one to retreat. She worked beside him with equal resolve, and together they moved through the days and nights like two laborers chained to a single task. Sometimes they returned home too weary to speak, collapsing into sleep only to rise and repeat the cycle again. Their meals were hasty, their clothing perpetually marked by stains and tears, their health already fraying at the edges. Yet in the midst of this hardship, they felt a strange exhilaration, for they knew they were touching the unseen. And indeed, they were. Slowly, through endless repetition, they began to isolate substances never before known to man. In 1898, they announced the existence of a new element, naming it polonium in honor of Marie's homeland, a quiet act of defiance against the powers that had suppressed her people. Later that year, they revealed another element, radium, whose glow had already begun to haunt their nights. These names, polonium and radium, seemed almost poetic, yet they were born not of poetry, but of years of grinding work in a shed unfit for the labor it contained. But even as the world began to take notice, their bodies carried the hidden toll. Their skin, often in contact with radioactive dust, began to show sores that would not heal easily. Their joints ached. Their fatigue deepened. At the time, the dangers were not understood. The glow of radium was seen as a marvel, a miracle. Samples were kept in pockets, displayed on shelves, admired for their beauty. It seemed to be a gift of the earth itself, pure and wondrous. Who could have guessed that the same glow which lit their nights with wonder was also gnawing invisibly at their blood and bones? Marie, for her part, never allowed herself to dwell on these discomforts. Her notebooks reveal no complaint, only the steady march of observations, calculations, results. She accepted pain as she accepted hunger in her youth, as she accepted loneliness in her student years. It was simply part of the path. Yet one cannot help but wonder, when she lay awake at night with her body trembling from exhaustion, did she ever feel a shadow of dread? Did she ever sense that the very substance she nurtured might also be devouring her? Or did she believe, as many pioneers do, that sacrifice is natural, that one must pay with flesh for truth? The outside world, slowly awakening to the marvel of radioactivity, celebrated the Curies with growing admiration. Their names began to appear in journals, their discoveries spoken of with awe. And yet, in those early years, the recognition brought little comfort. Their laboratory remained inadequate, their resources meager, their health fragile. They pressed on not for fame, but for the pursuit itself, driven by a devotion that seemed to blur the line between science and faith. For them, radium was not merely an element, it was a revelation, a sign that the universe was vaster, stranger, and more luminous than anyone had yet dared to believe. There is something haunting in the image of their nights during this time, the laboratory dark, the lamps extinguished, and yet the vials glowing faintly on the shelves, casting their cold light across the clutter of instruments. The glow was beautiful, almost holy, as if a fragment of the stars themselves had been captured and brought into that damp shed. They would stand together in the silence, watching the radiance, their faces illuminated by a light that seemed eternal. In those moments, perhaps, they felt they were touching the very fabric of creation. Yet in that same glow lay the seeds of their undoing. One winter evening, Marie's hands trembled as she wrote in her notebook. She paused, staring at the unsteady letters. Outside, snow fell softly on Paris, muffling the sounds of the city. Inside, the shed was damp and cold, her body weary beyond measure. Yet the vial on the table glowed steadily, indifferent to her fatigue. It offered no comfort, no warmth, only its pale, relentless light. She closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her forehead, feeling the ache deep in her bones. Still, when she lifted her pen again, she did not write of pain, only of numbers, results, and calculations. This was the paradox of her life, the body breaking, the spirit unyielding. She had chosen this path, and she would walk it to the end, whatever the cost. The glow of radium for her was worth every sacrifice. The snow continued to fall, silent and soft, covering the streets of Paris in a blanket of white. Inside the shed, the glow of radium burned steadily, unchanging, as though mocking the fragility of flesh. It was both promise and peril, beauty and danger. And as it cast its pale light across the weary figures of Marie and Pierre, it left them standing at the threshold of triumph and tragedy, unable yet to see which awaited them. The snow that had fallen outside the shed lay white and silent upon the streets of Paris, while within the laboratory the faint glow of radium burned steadily, indifferent to the seasons. That glow, cold yet strangely alive, accompanied their every trial, seeping into their hands, their hair, their notebooks. In time, it would also illuminate their names beyond the walls of the shed, for the world was beginning to take notice. The scientific community, cautious yet intrigued, whispered of the Curies and their strange discoveries, of radium's power, of a light born from matter itself. These whispers grew until they reached the vaulted halls of Sweden, where honors long reserved for men were now being considered for a woman who had labored in obscurity. In 1903, the Nobel Committee in Stockholm awarded the prize in physics to Henri Becquerel for the discovery of spontaneous radioactivity, and to Pierre Curie and his wife Marie for their joint research into the phenomenon. Yet the recognition did not come without hesitation. At first, the committee had intended to honor only Pierre and Becquerel, overlooking Marie as though her presence beside him were secondary, an assistant rather than a partner. It was Pierre who intervened, insisting that his wife's name be inscribed with his, that the record bear witness to their equal toil. Without his voice, her place might have been erased before it was even written. Thus it was that Marie Skłodowska-Curie, the girl who once studied secretly in Warsaw's hidden classrooms, became the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize. Yet the moment, luminous as it seemed, carried both pride and bitterness. To accept recognition only because her husband demanded it was to stand at once acknowledged and diminished. She smiled in public, accepted the medal with grace, but in the quiet of her thoughts, she must have wondered whether the world would ever see her fully, not as an appendage, but as a mind in her own right. The Nobel medal itself was heavy, its surface engraved with symbols of science and progress. To hold it was to feel the weight not only of achievement, but of history, tradition, and the countless barriers that had stood in her way. Did she feel triumph, or only fatigue? For even as the world applauded, her body carried the hidden wounds of radiation, her joints aching, her hands marked by sores, her strength ebbing more quickly than before. Glory and suffering walked side by side, inseparable companions. The ceremony in Stockholm was formal, filled with speeches and applause, the rustle of gowns, the gleam of chandeliers. Marie, who had lived in poverty and worked in a damp shed, found herself transported into a world of grandeur that seemed alien. She accepted it with dignity, but she did not revel in it. Fame was not her pursuit, and she wore its mantle uneasily. She thought not of banquets, but of her vials glowing quietly back in Paris, waiting for her return. The recognition, however, changed the course of their lives. With the Nobel Prize came opportunities, funding, and the promise of more stable conditions for their research. Yet with it also came scrutiny. The newspapers wrote of them, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with suspicion. The idea of a woman laureate unsettled the conservative order, and whispers circulated questioning whether her role had been as significant as Pierre's. These whispers reached her ears, of course, for gossip is a tide that spares no one. She bore it in silence, her resolve hardening. If the world doubted her, she would answer not with words, but with further discoveries. The Nobel Prize was a crown, but it was also a burden. It placed them on a pedestal from which every move was observed. Invitations arrived from across Europe, societies seeking lectures, academies offering memberships. Yet behind the ceremonies and honors lay the same unyielding truth. The shed still stood, damp and cold, and the work remained unfinished. Marie returned to it with renewed determination, for she believed that the honor of the Nobel was not an end, but only a step along a much longer path. Pierre, too, accepted the fame with reluctance. He was a man of inwardness, more at home with equations than with audiences. At times, the attention weighed heavily on him, and he longed for the quiet of his instruments rather than the applause of halls. Together, they found solace in their shared work, shutting out the noise of recognition when they could. Their bond deepened under the weight of fame, for it was a burden they shared, just as they shared their toil. And yet, despite the shadows, there was pride as well. Their daughters, Irene and Eve, watched as their parents' names appeared in newspapers and journals, their household marked by a renown rare for scientists. The children saw not only the medals but also the endless labor, the late nights, the fatigue etched into their parents' faces. They grew up in a home where science was not an abstraction, but the very air they breathed, the very rhythm of life. One winter evening after their return from Stockholm, Marie placed the Nobel medal on a table in their modest home. Its golden surface gleamed in the lamplight, heavy and silent. She looked at it for a long time, then turned away. To her, the medal was not a symbol of arrival, but a reminder of what still lay unfinished. The true prize was not recognition, but knowledge itself, and that prize could never be fully claimed. Outside, snow fell once again on Paris, soft and steady, muffling the noise of the city. Inside, the metal gleamed, but on the shelves nearby, the vials of radium glowed with a light far stranger, far more haunting. The metal would rest quietly, inert, but the radium would not. It shimmered in the dark, unrelenting, a reminder that their work was not only celebrated, but also perilous, demanding more than medals, demanding flesh and blood. Marie stood silently gazing at the glow, and in that moment she must have felt the weight of both triumph and foreboding. The Nobel Prize had lifted her name into history, but the true measure of her life would not be the medal, nor the applause, but the price she and Pierre were yet to pay for the light they had unleashed. The snow thickened outside, falling upon streets that would soon carry newsboys crying the names of laureates. But within the Curie household, the vials glowed steadily, their light a silent companion. And as Marie watched, the shadows deepened, as though the glow itself were a candle burning at both ends. The metal rested quietly on the table, gleaming only when the lamplight struck its surface. But the vials of radium glowed of their own accord, casting their pale light even when the room lay in darkness. That strange, eternal glow became a silent companion to Marie and Pierre, a reminder that their triumphs were unlike any other. Yet even as the world honored them, fate prepared its cruelest stroke, for glory is never immune to tragedy, and light often casts its deepest shadow. It was April of 1906, when the streets of Paris echoed with the sound of hooves and wheels upon wet cobblestones. Pierre Curie, absorbed as always in thought, hurried through the rain, his mind no doubt lingering on experiments, on lectures, on the pressing matters of research. The sky was low and gray, the air thick with drizzle, the stones slick beneath the weight of traffic. In an instant, the rhythm of the city became his undoing. A heavy horse-drawn carriage approached, its wheels grinding against the road, its driver unable to halt in time. Pierre slipped, fell beneath its path, and was crushed beneath the wheel. His life ended not in the quiet of a laboratory, nor the triumph of discovery, but in the chaos of a crowded street. News spread swiftly through Paris, carried by word of mouth, by newspapers, by whispers in lecture halls. Marie received it not as sound, but as silence, a silence so vast it seemed to erase all other noise. Her companion in life and in discovery, The man whose presence had been as constant as breath was gone in an instant. Death had taken him not with the dignity of illness, nor the warning of age, but with brutal swiftness, leaving her standing alone on the path they had walked together. The days that followed were veiled in mourning. The streets that once carried them on bicycles now carried her in a procession of grief. Friends and colleagues gathered, their faces solemn, their words inadequate. The laboratory stood quiet, its instruments untouched, its vials still glowing faintly as though indifferent to human loss. Marie moved through the rooms of her home like a shadow, her children clinging to her skirts, their questions unanswerable. She was widowed at 38, her heart torn between the role of mother and the role of scientist, her grief compounded by the unrelenting weight of unfinished work. In the silence after his death, she returned to his notebooks. His handwriting stared back at her, lines of equations cut short, mid-thought, words left unfinished. She traced them with her fingers, as though by touching the ink she might touch him again. But the ink was cold, the pages silent. All that remained of him was memory, and the glow of radium that had once illuminated their shared nights now seemed to her a cruel reminder of absence. Yet grief, in her, did not wither into idleness. It transformed itself into resolve. The Sorbonne, which had once seated Pierre in a professorial chair, now offered that same chair to her. It was not done out of generosity, but necessity. For who else could continue his lectures, his research, his vision? She accepted, though her acceptance was not for honor, but for continuity. In stepping into his place, she did not merely inherit his role. She defied the conventions of a society that believed women unfit for such stations. Thus, she became the first woman to teach at the Sorbonne, her voice echoing in halls where generations of men had lectured unchallenged. On the day of her first lecture, the hall was filled beyond its usual measure. Students, colleagues, and strangers came not only to hear her words, but to witness a spectacle, a woman ascending the pulpit of science. The room buzzed with anticipation, some curious, some skeptical, all aware that history was unfolding before them. Marie entered in silence, her face pale, her black gown severe, her figure slender and upright. She did not glance at the crowd. She walked directly to the lectern, set down her notes, and began. Her first words were the continuation of Pierre's last lecture. She spoke not of herself, not of grief, not of novelty, but of science, as though the thread had never been broken. The students listened, the air thick with awe and unease, for in that moment the boundaries of tradition cracked. The widow of Pierre Curie was no longer merely his companion or his collaborator. She was now his successor, his equal, his voice extended. In her words, his spirit lingered, and in her presence, a new chapter began. Yet beyond the lecture hall, grief remained. At night, when the children slept and the house grew silent, she sat alone at her desk, her eyes burning from fatigue, her heart heavy with absence. The photograph of Pierre rested nearby, his face frozen in the stillness of memory. Sometimes she spoke to it, though no reply came. Sometimes she simply stared, the hours slipping past like shadows across the floor. She had lost not only her husband, but her anchor, the steady presence that had borne her through years of hardship. Now she stood alone, with only her work to keep her upright. The laboratory, once filled with the sound of their shared labor, now echoed with her solitary footsteps. She lifted the same vessels, stirred the same mixtures, recorded the same results. But the silence was immense. Where once there had been conversation, there was only her own breath. Where once there had been companionship, there was only the glow of radium. That glow, eternal and indifferent, seemed almost mocking, reminding her that matter endures, even as flesh falls beneath wheels. Still, she persevered, for in grief she found a strange clarity. She would continue, not only for herself, but for him, for the promise they had shared, for the children who bore his name. Her sorrow did not diminish her strength, it sharpened it, forging her into something harder, colder, more unyielding. She had known suffering as a child, hunger as a student, exhaustion as a scientist, and now she knew grief as a widow. Each sorrow added to her endurance, layering her spirit like metal hammered in fire. One evening, as she worked late, she paused to rest her trembling hands. The laboratory was dim, the lamps nearly extinguished. On the bench before her lay a vial of radium, glowing faintly in the dark. She stared at it for a long time, her eyes reflecting its pale light. In its glow, she felt both presence and absence, triumph and tragedy. It was the light they had uncovered together, the light that had bound them, the light that now remained when he did not. It was beautiful and terrible, a reminder that even in loss, the universe continues its silent work. The glow lingered, steady and indifferent, casting shadows across the walls. And in that glow, Marie Curie, widow and mother, scientist and pioneer, resolved once more to endure. She would not falter, for the work was larger than grief, larger than love, larger even than life itself. The glow lingered on the bench where she had left it, pale and indifferent, a reminder of presence and absence in equal measure. It had been the light of their shared triumph, and now it was the light that kept her company in solitude. Pierre was gone, but the elements they had uncovered together remained, whispering their secrets only to those who would endure the labor of listening. And so Marie returned again and again to the shed laboratory, to the heavy sacks of pitchblende, to the endless boiling and separation, to the long nights in which the faint shimmer of radium seemed to hover in the air like the ghost of a star. Her grief did not lessen her discipline. If anything, it sharpened it into something almost severe. Each hour bent over furnaces, each page filled with calculations, each experiment repeated beyond the threshold of exhaustion. These were no longer merely acts of science. They were offerings, tributes to a promise left unfinished. To falter would have been to betray not only herself, but also the memory of Pierre. Thus she pressed on, her face drawn and pale, her body already weakened, yet her resolve harder than ever. The world began to call her discoveries by names that carried both poetry and weight. Polonium, named for the homeland she had left behind, remained a quiet reminder of her loyalty to a nation erased from maps, yet still alive in her heart. Radium, the element whose glow filled her nights, became the centerpiece of her work. Its properties seemed almost supernatural, emitting heat without flame, light without fuel, energy without end. To those who heard of it, radium seemed a miracle, a substance that could cure illness, illuminate darkness, perhaps even reshape industry itself. The fascination was immense, and soon laboratories across Europe spoke of it with awe. Yet while the world marveled at its promise, Marie bore the hidden cost. She handled powders and solutions with bare hands, inhaled dust from crushed ores, and carried vials in her pockets, unaware of the danger. At the time, no one understood the peril of radiation. No one imagined that invisible rays could burn flesh, poison blood, unravel the marrow of bones. They believed only in its promise. Marie herself spoke of radium as though it were a beneficent spirit, a light that might heal more than it harmed. Yet even as she praised it, her health betrayed her. Her fingers cracked and bled, her joints stiffened, her body grew fragile. Still, she worked without complaint, as though suffering were an inseparable part of discovery. The laboratory was filled with the smell of chemicals, the hiss of boiling mixtures, the scrape of tools against stone. Days blurred into nights, seasons passed unmarked, for she lived within a rhythm that acknowledged only the progress of her research. The children saw her rarely, often left in the care of others while she devoted herself to the laboratory. It was not neglect born of indifference, but a sacrifice demanded by the work. She loved them deeply, but she believed her duty extended beyond family, beyond personal comfort, beyond even her own body. At times, when fatigue pressed too heavily upon her, she paused to reflect on what it meant to seek truth at such cost. Was knowledge worth the burning of hands, the ache of bones, the solitude of nights spent in the company of silent vials? She never allowed the question to linger long. Her faith in science was not a faith of ease, but of necessity. To her, knowledge was not optional. It was the very condition of human dignity. If her body must be offered upon its altar, so be it. The recognition she received during these years was mixed with suspicion. Some hailed her as a pioneer, the very embodiment of modern science. Others whispered that her role had been exaggerated, that a woman could not possibly have achieved so much without the shadow of her husband guiding her. She bore these doubts as she bore her physical pain, silently, with endurance. She did not defend herself with words. She defended herself with results. Each paper she published, each experiment she perfected, was an answer sharper than speech. And yet, behind the facade of strength, her body faltered. There were days when her vision blurred, when her hands trembled too violently to hold a pen, when her limbs felt heavy as lead. On such days, she allowed herself no rest. Instead, she pressed harder, as though by sheer will she could command her body to obey. She wrote in notebooks until her handwriting grew uneven, the lines wavering like her breath. Still she wrote, for truth could not wait upon comfort. It is haunting to imagine the nights in that laboratory when the lamps had gone out and only the glow of radium remained. The vials shimmered with a pale, steady light, casting ghostly shadows upon the walls, illuminating the clutter of glassware, papers, and instruments. Marie, exhausted, might have rested her head upon the bench, her face bathed in the same glow that was quietly unraveling her health. To her, it was a marvel. To us, it is an omen. One evening, as she prepared another solution, she paused to hold a vial in her hand. The glow pulsed softly, as though alive, reflecting in her tired eyes. She must have felt both awe and kinship, for the element seemed to her a companion, tireless where she was weary, eternal where she was fragile. Yet it was also a silent predator, its invisible rays already threading through her blood. She did not know it, though perhaps she sensed it in the fatigue that deepened each year. But to turn away was unthinkable. To abandon radium was to abandon the very heart of her life. The outside world marveled at her discoveries, spoke of cures and wonders, dreamed of luminous watches and healing baths. They did not see the sores on her hands, the cough in her chest, the pallor of her skin. They saw only the miracle, not the martyrdom. And she allowed it, for she believed the miracle was larger than her suffering. In time, her work would bring her not only fame but another Nobel Prize, an honor no other had yet achieved. But in these years, the prize she carried was not gold, but the steady glow of radium, burning silently in the dark, consuming her even as it illuminated the path ahead. The laboratory grew still, the night deepening. On the bench, the vials glowed faintly, their light both beautiful and terrible. Marie, weary beyond measure, extinguished the last lamp and turned to leave. Yet, as she closed the door behind her, the glow remained, bathing the empty room in its pale fire, as if to remind the world that discovery is never free, and that every light casts a shadow. The glow remained in the laboratory long after she had closed the door, pale and steady, a light that neither flickered nor dimmed. It waited in silence, indifferent to fatigue, indifferent to sorrow, indifferent to the fragile body of the woman who had drawn it from the earth. And as the years passed, that same glow carried her name further and further into the world until it reached again the halls of Sweden, where honors were bestowed in the language of permanence. In 1911, the Nobel Committee awarded Marie Curie the prize in chemistry for her discovery of polonium and radium and for her tireless labor in isolating these mysterious elements. She stood alone this time, no husband at her side, no partner to share the applause. Her name was announced, and the hall stirred with both admiration and unease. For to award a second Nobel Prize to the same person was rare enough, but to award it to a woman was unprecedented. She became the only person to have been honored in two different sciences, physics and chemistry, a recognition that set her apart not only from her peers, but from history itself. And yet, within her, triumph was tempered by the weight of fatigue and the sting of controversy. The prize came not in a vacuum, but in a storm. The world, ever eager to exalt and to condemn, whispered of her private life with the same fervor that it praised her discoveries. Newspapers, hungry for scandal, wrote not only of radium but of her heart, of her connection to the physicist Paul Langevin, a man bound by marriage yet drawn into her orbit. Letters, real or imagined, were circulated with malice. Crowds gathered outside her home, shouting insults, hurling stones at her windows. The woman who had uncovered elements unknown to man was judged not for her science, but for her supposed sins, her private griefs made public spectacle. And so the Nobel Prize, which should have been pure triumph, was shadowed by humiliation. She traveled to Stockholm under the gaze of suspicion, her presence a provocation to some, an inspiration to others. When she stood before the assembly to receive her medal, her figure was as austere as ever, her face pale, her eyes steady. She accepted the honor with dignity, yet the silence beneath her calm was heavy. For she knew that while her discoveries were luminous, her humanity had been cast in darkness by those who sought scandal. Still, the medal was hers, and the recognition undeniable. She placed it beside the first, two golden discs that marked not the sum of her worth, but the acknowledgement of her labor. Few could claim such distinction. None could diminish the truth inscribed in those honors, that her perseverance had uncovered forces hidden since the birth of the earth itself. Yet the triumph was not sweetness. Her health was failing, her body weakened by years of exposure to substances whose danger she had not fully grasped. Her hands trembled, her vision clouded, her strength ebbed. She walked through the corridors of her laboratory like a ghost of herself, pale and thin, yet still unyielding. She refused to stop, refused to surrender to rest. For her, rest was not peace, but defeat. And so she pressed on, lecturing, writing, experimenting, even as her enemies sharpened their voices. Some colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be tainted by scandal. Others rallied to her side, recognizing that genius is never pure, that human beings are not only minds, but hearts, fragile and fallible. She accepted neither comfort nor condemnation. She accepted only the work. It is haunting to imagine her during this time, standing in a lecture hall, her voice calm though her body trembled, explaining the properties of radium to students who saw not only a professor but a legend. Her black gown hung loosely on her frame, her eyes shadowed with fatigue, yet her mind remained sharp. She spoke of invisible rays, of energies that pass through solid matter, of potentials not yet fully imagined. She spoke as though nothing else mattered, as though the jeers outside her home, the rumors in the press, the weakness of her body, were all trivial compared to the truth she sought. At night, when she returned home, the medals lay quiet, inert symbols of a restless life. On her shelves, the vials of radium glowed faintly, steady and pale. The metals would not harm her. The radium already had. and yet she held greater affection for the glow than for the gold, for it was the glow that spoke to her of the universe's hidden order, the glow that whispered of mysteries still beyond reach. The irony is almost unbearable, to be crowned by the world for discoveries that were slowly unmaking her, to be celebrated and condemned in the same breath, to stand as the only person to hold 2 Nobel Prizes and yet to feel more isolated than ever. Such is the paradox of greatness. It elevates, but it also estranges. It honors, but it also exposes. One winter evening, after the noise of the day had subsided, she sat at her desk, her hands trembling as she wrote. The medals rested in a drawer, forgotten for the moment. On the table before her was a vial of radium, glowing faintly in the dark. She paused, looking at it with eyes that held both awe and weariness. It had been the light of her triumph, the cause of her suffering, the source of her fame, the seed of her isolation. It was her companion, her adversary, her legacy. She reached out, touched the glass lightly with her fingertips, and felt the faint warmth it emitted. It pulsed softly, as though alive, indifferent to her fatigue, indifferent to the whispers of society, indifferent to the medals hidden in the drawer. In its glow, she saw both victory and tragedy, both immortality and mortality. It was beautiful, and it was terrible. The vial continued to glow, steady and silent, casting its light across the papers on her desk. And in that light, Marie Curie sat alone, laureate of 2 sciences, pioneer of a new age, yet also a woman burdened by scandal, weakened by illness, and haunted by solitude. The glow did not waver. It was eternal. She was not. The vial glowed faintly upon her desk, indifferent to triumph, indifferent to shame. It knew nothing of medals hidden in drawers, nor of whispers carried through salons and cafes. It shone with the same pale light, unchanging, even as Marie Curie found her life engulfed in shadows, not of science, but of scandal. The year was 1911, the same year her second Nobel Prize had been awarded, and though she had scaled a height no other had reached, the world now seemed more eager to pull her down than to celebrate her ascent. The cause was not her discoveries, but her heart. She had found solace, companionship, and perhaps love in the company of Paul Langevin, a fellow physicist and a man of restless mind. He was brilliant, spirited, and alive with questions. But he was also bound by marriage to a woman from whom he was estranged, yet not divorced. Their relationship, born of shared inquiry and loneliness, became the subject of gossip, then of rumor, and finally of public outrage. Letters, whether stolen or forged, were published in the press. Private words became public weapons. What had been human became scandal. The newspapers feasted upon it. Editors printed her name not as a laureate but as a seductress, a destroyer of homes, a foreign woman who had dared to take not only honors but also affections deemed not hers to claim. The conservative heart of France, already uneasy with her foreign birth and her unprecedented success, now seized upon this story with venom. Crowds gathered before her home, shouting insults, hurling stones. Windows shattered, the cries of adulteress echoed through the streets. To many, she was no longer the woman who had brought forth elements from the earth's depths, but a figure of disgrace. Marie, who had endured hunger, exile, and grief, now endured humiliation. She did not protest in public, did not lower herself to denials or counter-accusations. She stood in silence, her face pale, her body weakened by illness, her spirit tested by outrage. She continued to work, continued to lecture, continued to write, as though the storm outside her door did not exist. Yet the storm battered her still, for no one can be wholly untouched by the cruelty of mobs. Her daughters, Irene and Eve, heard the insults hurled against their mother, saw the stones strike their windows, felt the weight of judgment fall upon their household. It is difficult to measure the cost of such public shame. To a woman who had given herself to science with such purity of purpose, to be judged not for her mind but for her private life must have been unbearable. And yet she bore it, as she bore every trial with endurance that seemed unearthly. She wrote to colleagues not of scandal, but of radium. She prepared lectures, she published results, she kept her gaze upon the unseen world of particles and rays. If the world wished to condemn her, she would answer not with protest, but with perseverance. Still, there were moments when the strain broke through. In letters to friends, her words carried the weight of despair. She spoke of isolation, of exhaustion, of the cruelty of a society that would exalt her one day and condemn her the next. She confessed that she longed for quiet, for a reprieve from the endless noise of judgment. Yet even in these confessions, there was no surrender. She never abandoned her work, never abandoned her belief that truth was worth suffering. In Stockholm, when she appeared to receive her Nobel Prize, she faced the assembly with composure, though she knew that many of those present had read the scandals in the press. She did not falter, did not apologize. She spoke of her discoveries with the same calm as before, refusing to allow gossip to intrude upon the sanctity of science. Some admired her dignity, others muttered of impropriety, but none could deny the brilliance that lay behind her words. In that hall, as in the laboratory, she stood alone, resolute, untouchable in her devotion to truth. Yet back in France, the mob did not quiet easily. The scandal lingered, feeding upon itself, staining her reputation in ways that would never wholly fade. For women, judgment is rarely confined to the moment. It echoes across decades, reshaping how history remembers them. For men, affairs might be overlooked or forgiven, but for Marie, they became a mark of condemnation, used to diminish her even as her work reshaped the world. There is a haunting irony in this chapter of her life. She who had given herself so completely to science, who had sacrificed health, comfort, and even joy, was condemned for the mere suggestion that she had reached for human warmth. She who had uncovered energies that would light the path of medicine and physics was judged unworthy of love. Her scandal was not in what she had done, but in what society could not allow her to be, both a woman and a genius. One evening, as stones rattled against her shutters and insults rose in the street, she sat alone in her study. The medals lay hidden, the newspapers scattered with headlines that distorted her life. Before her, as always, was a vial of radium, glowing faintly in the dark. She watched it in silence, her face pale, her hands trembling. Outside, the mob raged. Inside, the glow remained steady, indifferent to scandal, indifferent to shame, indifferent to the cruelty of the world. She reached for her pen and began to write, her handwriting unsteady but determined. She did not write of Langevin, nor of gossip, nor of insult. She wrote of isotopes, of measurements, of the properties of radiation. For this was her defiance, her quiet rebellion, to continue the work when all else demanded her surrender. The mob could break her windows, but not her will. The press could tarnish her name, but not her truth. And so the vial glowed on, casting its pale light across her papers, while outside the voices of condemnation swelled and faded like waves against stone. She endured, as she always had, with silence, with labor, with resolve. For in the end, she believed that history would remember not the whispers of scandal, but the light of discovery. The night deepened. The crowd dispersed, their footsteps fading into the silence of Paris streets. The shutters, cracked and broken, let in the cold air. Marie sat still at her desk, her face illuminated by the glow of radium. It was a lonely light, beautiful and terrible, the light of triumph and of suffering, the light that would accompany her to the very end. The light of the vial shone upon her papers long after the crowd outside had dispersed, pale and unwavering, while her pen scratched steadily across the page. Outside, Paris lay in uneasy silence. But beyond that silence, the continent trembled. The year was 1914, and the rumblings of war that had long been gathering broke at last into thunder. Guns spoke where once only rumors had stirred, and Europe descended into a conflict unlike any it had ever known. For Marie Curie, who had endured hunger, exile, grief, and scandal, another trial now beckoned, not of the laboratory, but of the battlefield. When the first shots rang across borders, she was no longer young, no longer strong of body, yet still fierce of spirit. She might have retreated into safety, hidden behind the laurels of her 2 Nobel Prizes, withdrawn into quiet work far from the din of armies. But retreat was never her nature. Where there was need, she stepped forward. She saw that science must not remain confined to laboratories or lecture halls while men bled and died in the mud of fields. And so she turned her mind, once devoted to isolating radium, toward the urgent task of saving lives on the front. The weapon she carried was not radium itself, but another fruit of her labor, the X-ray. Its invisible rays, capable of penetrating flesh, revealed the hidden fractures and bullets within bodies torn by war. Hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded, surgeons groping blindly in flesh without knowledge of what lay within. Marie knew that science could pierce the skin without cutting, could illuminate what hands could not see. She resolved to bring this light to the battlefield. Yet there were no instruments ready, no vehicles prepared, no system in place. She began with nothing but conviction. With the same determination that had once carried her through hunger and loneliness in Paris, she set about creating what would become known as the Petites Curies. Mobile radiology units mounted on automobiles, carrying X-ray equipment directly to the front. She organized, she improvised, she persuaded generals, doctors, and donors, fighting through skepticism and bureaucracy with the quiet force of her will. The first of these units rattled forward to the war zones, their wheels grinding over rutted roads, their engines coughing in the cold air. Inside, the machines hummed, fragile yet miraculous. Marie herself trained as a driver and mechanic, refusing to delegate the hardships to others. She learned to handle engines, to repair parts, to drive across muddy fields under bombardment. At an age when many women would have withdrawn into domestic quiet, she sat behind the wheel of war's machinery, her black dress replaced by the garb of necessity, her hands steady on controls that carried life into places of death. Not content with her own efforts, she trained others, young women, many scarcely more than girls, in the operation of X-ray machines. In makeshift classrooms, she taught them not only the physics of rays, but also the discipline of courage, for their work would take them into the very maw of battle. These women, inspired by her example, became pioneers themselves, stepping into roles society had never imagined for them. They carried with them the light of science into the darkness of war, guided by her instruction, fortified by her resolve. On the battlefield, the Petites Curies became lifelines. Wounded soldiers groaning on stretchers were brought into the cramped vehicles. The machines crackled, screens glowed faintly, and within minutes the hidden map of bone and metal was revealed. Surgeons, once blind, now saw with clarity where to cut, where to spare. Lives were saved, limbs preserved, pain alleviated. The soldiers, many of them simple men who knew nothing of radium or Nobel Prizes, came to bless the name of the woman whose strange machines spared them agony. They did not call her Madame Curie. They called her the Lady of the X-rays. Yet the war was merciless. The roads shook with shell fire, skies split with artillery, fields turned to mud and blood. Marie, frail in health, endured conditions that would have broken younger bodies. She drove through nights without sleep, repaired engines in freezing rain, carried equipment across trenches filled with stench. Her body weakened further, her hands blistered, her lungs strained, Yet she pressed on, for she could not turn away from suffering. To retreat was unthinkable. To endure was her only choice. In the quiet moments between duties, she must have felt the weight of irony. The rays that once glowed in her laboratory with promise now revealed broken bones and shattered flesh. Science, which she had believed would lift humanity, was now entangled with war, with wounds, with suffering. Did she wonder whether knowledge itself was neutral, a tool that could heal or destroy depending on who wielded it? Did she question whether the light she had uncovered was meant for this, to illuminate the wreckage of bodies rather than the mysteries of matter? She never wrote such doubts, but perhaps they lingered in the silence of her thoughts. Still, the work was not without hope. For every soldier whose life was saved, every limb spared from amputation, every wound made less cruel, there was proof that science could serve compassion even in the midst of violence. She held to this, as she had always held to the belief that truth, though costly, was worth the sacrifice. And in this, she was not alone. Her daughter, Irene, still young, worked by her side, assisting with radiology, learning the discipline of precision and the ethic of service. The torch was already passing, though neither mother nor daughter could yet see how brightly it would burn in years to come. The war dragged on, years of mud and steel, of gas and fire, of millions lost. Through it all, the Petites Curies continued their work, rattling across fields, humming in tents, glowing in the shadows of ruined churches and makeshift hospitals. Marie herself oversaw more than 100 radiology units, a network she had created almost from nothing. It was one of her greatest achievements, though the world would remember it less than her Nobel Prizes. Yet for those whose lives were saved, it was the truest measure of her genius, not in discovery alone, but in service. When the war ended, the silence that followed was as heavy as the roar that had preceded it. Fields lay scarred, cities ruined, families broken. Marie returned to her laboratory, her health further diminished, her body frailer than before. Yet she carried with her the memory of soldiers whose faces had brightened with relief, whose lives had been spared by the invisible rays she had harnessed. The glow of radium still burned in her vials, but now she had seen another kind of light, the light of science applied not only to discovery, but to mercy. One evening, back in Paris, she sat at her desk once more. The vials glowed faintly, steady and indifferent as they always had. She watched them in silence, her hands trembling, her lungs weak, her body weary. Yet in her mind she carried the image of battlefields lit not by flames of destruction, but by the soft glow of X-ray screens, revealing broken bones so they might be healed. The glow of radium, the glow of X-rays, the glow of science itself, all were the same. All were light, wrested from darkness. The night deepened, and outside the city breathed in relief after years of war. Inside her study, the vials glowed steadily, indifferent as ever. Yet to Marie Curie, their glow was no longer only the light of discovery. It was also the light of survival, the light of mercy, the light that had accompanied her through yet another trial of endurance. The vials glowed faintly on the shelves of her study, pale companions of long years, indifferent to war, indifferent to peace. They had glowed through the thunder of shells, through the rattle of ambulances, through the cries of the wounded, and now they glowed still, in the silence of a city breathing again after slaughter. Marie Curie, weary and frail, returned from battlefields to her laboratory, to her desk, to her family. Yet though her body bore the weight of age and illness, she carried within her the steady flame of endurance. And it was this flame that lit the path not only for herself, but for her daughters. Irene the elder had already stood by her mother's side during the war, working among the Petites Curies, learning not only the mechanics of X-ray machines, but also the discipline of courage. She had driven through muddy roads, adjusted sputtering equipment, and faced the sight of broken soldiers with steady hands. For her, science was not an abstraction, nor a luxury of academies. It was a tool, a duty, a calling to serve. She absorbed from her mother not only equations and procedures, but the ethic that knowledge must be carried into the world, however heavy the burden. Her eyes burned with the same intensity that had once illuminated Marie's youth, her brow furrowed in concentration that mirrored her mother's. Eve, the younger, followed another path. Where her sister was drawn to laboratories, Eve was drawn to words and music. Her fingers lingered not on instruments of glass and metal, but on piano keys, her notebooks filled not with formulas, but with reflections. She watched her mother from a distance, admiring her, yet knowing that her own voice would be different, her own contribution of another kind. To her, Marie was not only the scientist of radium and X-rays, but also the fragile, weary woman who returned home late, her eyes shadowed, her body trembling. Eve sought to preserve not discoveries, but memories, to give voice to the humanity behind the legend. Thus the daughters, though walking different paths, carried fragments of the same inheritance, the unyielding devotion of their mother, the shadow of sacrifice, the light of endurance. For children of pioneers are never free of the weight of their parents' labors. They inherit not only names, but burdens, not only pride, but sorrow. In the Curie household, this inheritance was palpable, etched into every wall, every shelf, every breath of air heavy with the scent of chemicals and books. Marie, though absorbed in her work, never forgot the children. Her letters reveal tenderness, concern, and pride, even when her time was consumed by experiments or lectures. She spoke of their futures with hope, though she knew that hope was never certain. She encouraged Irene's interest in science, guiding her with patience, correcting her with precision, pushing her gently but firmly toward the rigor required of discovery. With Eve, she was more reserved, less certain of how to nurture an artistic soul so different from her own, yet she watched her with quiet admiration. Perhaps she envied her younger daughter's ability to step outside the world of rays and atoms, to find joy in music, to embrace life without the weight of laboratories. There were evenings when the three of them sat together, the daughters listening as their mother spoke not of medals or scandals, but of ideas, of the mysteries of nature, of the endless questions that still remained unanswered. The lamp burned low, the vials glowed faintly on the shelves, and the room filled with the quiet hum of thought shared across generations. For though the world might remember Marie Curie as an isolated figure, a solitary pioneer, she was also a mother, shaping the lives of her children as surely as she shaped her experiments. And yet, beneath this tenderness, there was also distance. Science consumed her, not by choice, but by necessity. She could not always be present, could not always soften the harshness of her schedule or the severity of her health. Irene and Eve grew up with the knowledge that their mother's devotion was vast but divided, that her love was expressed not in idle hours, but in the weight of example. They bore this without resentment, for they understood, even as children, that their mother's path was unlike any other, and that to walk beside her was both privilege and trial. Irene, in time, would step fully into her mother's footsteps, becoming not only a scientist but a laureate in her own right, her work with her husband Frédéric Joliot leading to discoveries of their own. Eve would write her mother's biography, preserving her story for generations, ensuring that the woman behind the legend would not be forgotten. Both daughters, in their ways, became mirrors of Marie's legacy, one in science, one in memory. But in these years, as the war ended and life resumed its fragile rhythm, they were still only daughters, watching their mother grow frailer, seeing her hands tremble, her face pale, her steps slow. They watched her endure pain she never spoke aloud, watched her press on despite illness, watched her sacrifice herself again and again upon the altar of discovery. Did they wonder, as children often do, whether the work she loved was also the work that stole her from them? Did they resent the glowing vials that occupied her nights, the papers that consumed her days? Or did they see in her only the figure of endurance, the example of strength, the embodiment of purpose? Perhaps all these at once, for love and longing are never simple, are never. One evening, after a long day in the laboratory, Marie returned home exhausted. Irene sat at a desk, bent over her studies, her face lit by lamplight. Eve sat at the piano, her fingers touching the keys lightly, filling the room with soft music. Marie paused in the doorway, her body trembling with fatigue, her mind heavy with calculations unfinished. She watched her daughters, one bent toward science, the other toward art, and for a moment she allowed herself a rare smile. Here was her legacy, not metals, not radium, but life itself continuing, branching, expanding beyond her own frail body. The music filled the room, mingling with the rustle of papers, the faint scent of ink, the distant glow from the laboratory vials. Marie closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, letting her fatigue rest for a moment in the presence of her children. The glow remained steady, indifferent as ever, but in the music there was warmth. In the children there was hope. For even as her body weakened, her daughters carried forward the flame, each in their own way. The night deepened. The piano fell silent. The lamp burned low. The house grew still. On the shelves, the vials glowed faintly, casting their pale light across the quiet room. Marie sat in her chair, her eyes heavy, her hands resting in her lap. Beside her, Irene closed her books. Eve laid her hands gently upon the keys. The glow remained, steady and eternal, a reminder that legacy is not only in discovery, but in the lives one shapes, in the daughters who sit quietly beside a weary mother, bearing her flame into the future. The house grew still after the music faded, the daughters retreating to their rooms, the lamps extinguished one by one, leaving only the faint, unearthly glow of the vials on the shelves. They glimmered like fragments of stars brought down to earth, constant, indifferent, unchanging. Yet the woman who had coaxed them into light was not unchanging. Year by year, the toll of her devotion pressed harder upon her, and the strength that had carried her through hunger, exile, grief, scandal, and war began to falter. Her body, like the notebook she filled, bore the marks of time and of exposure to forces invisible. Her hands, once steady in the laboratory, trembled more often now. The sores upon her skin healed slowly, if at all, the wounds reopening with the smallest of touches. Her joints stiffened, her bones ached, her breath grew short with effort. There were days when her eyes clouded, her vision dimming, and yet she still bent over papers, squinting to read her own lines. The fatigue was not the ordinary weariness of age, nor merely the exhaustion of labor. It was something deeper, something born of years spent in close company with the very substances she had discovered. Radiation, though not yet fully understood, had seeped into her, altering her blood, her marrow, her flesh. The glow that others admired from afar was slowly unmaking her from within, and yet she pressed on, to pause, to rest, to withdraw. These were foreign to her nature. She rose each day, however frail, and returned to her work. In the laboratory, she measured and mixed, though now with slower movements, with heavier breaths. Her notebooks filled with numbers still, though the handwriting grew uneven, the lines wavering across the page. Where once her script had been sharp and precise, it now bore the signs of a hand unsteady, of a body faltering. Still she wrote, determined that the decline of flesh would not silence the persistence of the mind. Her colleagues saw the changes, though they seldom spoke of them aloud. Some whispered that she was too stubborn, that she risked herself needlessly, that she should rest and preserve what remained of her strength. Others admired her even more, seeing in her frailty not weakness, but the proof of sacrifice. She ignored both whispers and admiration alike. Her loyalty was not to the opinions of others, but to the work itself, and as long as she could hold a pen, as long as she could lift a vial, she would not surrender. Her daughters, too, saw the decline. Irene, now a woman grown and already deep into her own scientific path, recognized the signs with the clarity of a fellow researcher. She knew what radiation could do, knew it not only from experiments, but from the very body of her mother before her eyes. Eve, more attuned to the subtleties of human expression, saw the shadows in her mother's face, the heaviness in her movements, the rare flicker of pain across her brow. They both worried, both urged her to rest, but they knew as well as she did that her will would not bend. To ask her to withdraw from science was to ask her to abandon life itself. At times, when the pain was too great, she would close her eyes and remember earlier days, the attic in Paris where she had studied by candlelight, the shed where she and Pierre had labored side by side, the bicycles that had carried them through countryside fields, the lecture halls filled with anticipation and doubt. These memories came not as nostalgia, but as confirmation, proof that every stage of her life had demanded endurance, and that this stage was no different. She had always borne hardship. Why should she not bear it now? Still, there were moments of reflection, of quiet recognition that the very elements she had given to the world were also her undoing. She had discovered radium and polonium, had revealed their beauty, their promise, their power. And now, they revealed their price. She did not write of regret, but perhaps she felt its shadow. Perhaps she wondered, as she traced wavering lines in her notebook, whether she had asked too much of her body in service to truth. Yet even if regret lingered, it never overcame her resolve. For her, discovery was not a choice, but a calling, and calling does not bend to fear. One evening, her hands shaking, she tried to write a series of equations. The ink spread unevenly, blotting the page. She paused, her breath shallow, her eyes straining to focus. For a moment she set down the pen and rested her head upon her arm. The room was dim, the only light the glow of radium from a vial across the bench. It illuminated her face. Pale and lined, her eyes half closed, her expression weary yet steadfast. In that glow, she seemed both mortal and eternal, a body failing yet a spirit unbroken. Her notebooks from these years still exist, though they are too dangerous to handle without protection, their pages saturated with radiation. They bear the handwriting of a woman in decline, yet still they pulse with her determination, her refusal to surrender. They are artifacts not only of science, but of sacrifice, filled with numbers and words that testify to a devotion stronger than the limits of flesh. To read them is to hear her voice, trembling yet insistent, echoing across the silence of time. The world, too, noticed her frailty, though it did not diminish its demands. She was still invited to lecture, still expected to lead, still sought for her counsel. She traveled when she could, though the journeys left her exhausted, her body aching from the strain. In foreign halls, she stood before audiences, her figure small and fragile, her voice faint but clear. She spoke of discoveries, of elements, of possibilities yet to come. Those who listened saw not only a scientist, but a survivor, a woman who had borne more than most and still stood upright. And yet, behind the dignity of her lectures, the weight of decline pressed harder. There were nights when she could scarcely lift herself from her chair, when her vision blurred so fully she could not read, when her body seemed to tremble with every breath. Still, She did not withdraw. She worked by touch when sight failed, by memory when strength waned. She lived not for comfort, but for continuity, determined that the thread of discovery must not be broken, even if she herself unraveled. The notebooks piled higher, their pages uneven, their ink blotted, their handwriting trembling. They bore witness not only to science, but to sacrifice, not only to equations, but to endurance. And as they gathered upon her desk, the vials on the shelves glowed steadily, indifferent to her weakening body, indifferent to the pain etched into her hands. Their light remained constant, even as hers began to fade. One evening, as the house grew silent and her daughters slept, she sat alone with her notebooks spread before her. Her pen slipped from her hand, clattering softly against the wood. She stared at the wavering lines, at the words that faltered halfway across the page. The glow from the vials cast its pale light across her papers, across her weary face, across the room heavy with silence. She closed her eyes, her breath shallow, her body trembling. And yet within her the same resolve remained, unbroken, unyielding. The glow lingered, indifferent, eternal. She was not eternal. Her notebooks were not eternal. Yet in that moment the light and the woman who had drawn it forth sat together once more, bound by both triumph and tragedy, by both discovery and decline. The glow lingered upon her desk, steady and indifferent, even as her handwriting wavered and her body trembled. The notebooks piled higher, fragile records of a will that refused to bend. Yet beyond the walls of her study, beyond the dim rooms heavy with silence, the world remembered her not only as a frail woman at her desk, but as a figure of legend. Her name had traveled far, across oceans carried not only by scientists, but by newspapers, magazines, and whispers of admiration. And in time, this renown drew her from the solitude of her laboratory into another arena entirely, the strange and uneasy realm of celebrity. In the early 1920s, her health already diminished. Marie Curie was invited to travel to the United States. The purpose was not merely honor, but necessity. To raise funds for the purchase of radium, for the laboratories of Europe were poor, and radium was more costly than gold. A single gram, refined with painstaking labor, commanded a price beyond the reach of most institutions, and yet she needed it, for her research could not advance without it. Thus she consented to the journey, though it wearied her, though she disliked the noise of fame, though she longed only for her quiet laboratory. Her arrival in America was greeted with spectacle. Crowds gathered at docks and train stations, eager to glimpse the pale, austere figure who had twice won the Nobel Prize. Newspapers heralded her as the greatest woman of science, the conqueror of the atom, the widow who had triumphed over sorrow. Photographers jostled to capture her image, their bulbs flashing, their lenses fixed upon her face. She endured it all with calm, though within her she felt only unease. Fame was not her pursuit, and applause was never her goal. She stood in silence as others praised her, her mind already drifting back to her laboratory, to her notebooks, to her vials that glowed faintly in the dark. Yet the journey was not without purpose. In Washington, she was received by President Harding, who presented her with a gift of radium, 1 gram, purchased through donations gathered by American women who had raised funds with determination and pride. It was placed into her hands not as a symbol of wealth, but as a symbol of solidarity, of nations recognizing her labor and her sacrifice. She accepted it with dignity, though even then she seemed more weary than triumphant, more grateful than exalted. For her, the gift was not glory, but necessity, a tool that would allow her work to continue, a fragment of light to keep her flame alive. The American press, however, saw her differently. They wrote of her as though she were a saint, a figure of purity and sacrifice, a woman untouched by vanity or ambition. They exalted her with words that bordered on worship, painting her as both mother and martyr of science. She did not recognize herself in these portrayals, for she knew her flaws, her doubts, her frailties. But she did not protest. She allowed the image to stand, for if it brought her the resources she needed, then it served its purpose. The tour continued across the country. In cities and towns, she was greeted with applause, speeches, parades. Universities offered her honors. Societies bestowed medals. Citizens crowded to catch a glimpse of her frail figure. She stood through it all, her face pale, her body trembling, her heart heavy with the burden of attention. She would have preferred the silence of her laboratory, the quiet glow of her vials, the scratch of her pen across paper. Yet she endured the noise, for she knew it was not for herself, but for science, for the radium that would keep discovery alive. And yet, in the midst of this, there was also tenderness. The American women who had raised funds for her gift did so not out of duty, but out of admiration. Their devotion genuine, their respect profound. They saw in her not only a scientist, but a figure of inspiration, proof that women too could break barriers, could command respect in halls once closed to them. Marie, who seldom thought of herself as a symbol, became one nonetheless. She carried that burden with dignity, even if she never sought it. The irony of her situation was not lost upon her. She had spent her life fleeing recognition, shunning spectacle, living with austerity, caring nothing for fashion or fame. And now, in her frailty, the world pressed fame upon her more than ever. She accepted it as she accepted illness, grief, and sacrifice, silently with endurance. But when the speeches ended, when the applause faded, when the train carried her away from another cheering crowd, she sat in her compartment quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes gazing out the window at the passing fields. Her thoughts drifted not to the adulation she had received, but to her daughters, to her laboratory, to the quiet glow of radium waiting for her return. Back in France, when the journey was done, the gram of radium was placed into her laboratory with care. It was a treasure not of wealth, but of survival, the fruit of admiration and solidarity across oceans. She resumed her work, frail yet determined, her notebooks filling once more, her hands trembling but steady enough to hold her pen. The glow returned to her nights, constant and indifferent as ever, yet the memory of America lingered. She had seen how the world looked upon her, how her image had been shaped into something larger than herself, something both inspiring and confining. She knew that she had become not only a scientist, but a symbol, a figure used to speak of progress, of perseverance, of the triumph of women. She accepted this with the same silence she accepted every trial, but within her, she longed only to be what she had always been, a seeker of truth, a servant of knowledge, a woman bent over her desk, her face illuminated by the glow of a vial. One evening, as she sat once more at her desk in Paris, the vials glowed faintly on the shelves, casting their pale light across the room. She thought of the crowds in America, of the applause, of the medals pressed into her hands, of the gram of radium given to her with ceremony. She thought of the women who had raised funds, of the journalists who had written her into legend, of the president who had bowed before her presence. And then she looked back at her papers, her ink, her trembling hands. The glow remained steady, indifferent to fame, indifferent to honors, indifferent to history. She smiled faintly, for in that indifference she found comfort. Fame fades, applause ceases, but truth endures. The glow lingered, pale and eternal, casting shadows across the frail woman at her desk. Outside, Paris breathed, alive with noise and life. Inside, she sat in silence, her body failing, her spirit unyielding. She had carried her name across oceans, had received honors from presidents, had become a symbol to millions. And yet in the end, she was still the same woman who had once studied in a cold attic by candlelight, who had once stirred cauldrons in a damp shed, who had once stood beside a man she loved in the pursuit of hidden truths. The night deepened, the vials glowed, and Marie Curie, weary yet steadfast, bent once more over her papers, writing into the silence, her legacy unfolding in lines that trembled yet endured. The night deepened as the vials glowed, casting their pale, unwavering light across her desk. Papers lay scattered, her handwriting fragile but insistent, each line a thread of persistence against the encroaching shadows of frailty. Yet while she bent in solitude over equations and notes, beyond her small circle of lamplight, the world awaited her presence in places larger, more public, more demanding. For Marie Curie was not only a researcher in her laboratory, not only a mother guiding her daughters, not only a weary body enduring illness. She was also a professor of the Sorbonne, the first woman to ascend to that chair, her voice echoing in halls that had never before known a female lecturer. The Sorbonne, with its vaulted ceilings and austere grandeur, had for centuries been a fortress of learning, yet also of exclusion. Women had walked its corridors only as shadows, never as voices. When Marie Curie stepped into its lecture halls, clad always in black, her figure slender, her face pale, she carried with her not only the weight of knowledge, but the silent defiance of centuries of silence. Students gathered in throngs, some out of curiosity, some out of respect, some out of skepticism, for all knew they were witnessing a departure from tradition. She entered quietly without flourish, her presence unadorned. The murmurs in the hall softened into silence as she reached the lectern, her notes held firmly in trembling hands. She did not speak of herself, nor of barriers broken, nor of fame attained. She spoke of science, of equations and experiments, of rays and elements. Her voice was steady, low but clear, carrying through the hall not with force but with gravity. Those who listened leaned forward, drawn not by theatrics, but by the weight of her words, by the authority of one who had lived every principle she described. Her lectures were not performances, but continuations of her work, extensions of the notebooks she filled in solitude. She laid out facts with precision, guiding her students through the intricacies of radiation, the nature of elements, the mysteries of matter. There was no ornament, no attempt to please, no concession to those who expected a spectacle. She was, as always, austere, and yet in that austerity lay a kind of fire, a devotion so absolute that it ignited respect even in the skeptical. Students remembered not the sound of her voice, but the intensity of her presence, the sense that they were in the company of someone who lived for truth alone. In those halls, she was not merely a widow carrying forward her husband's legacy, nor a scandalized woman defending her name, nor a celebrity paraded across continents. She was a professor, a scientist, a teacher. Her lectures, though plain, carried the weight of authority drawn from a life of endurance. She had worked in poverty, discovered in obscurity, grieved in solitude, triumphed in defiance. And now, her words carried all these threads, woven invisibly into each line of science she spoke. There is something haunting in imagining those moments, the vast hall filled with students, the air thick with anticipation, the silence broken only by her calm voice. The chalk traced across the blackboard, her hand steady despite tremors, leaving lines of equations that glowed faintly in the dust. The students scribbled furiously, their eyes fixed upon her, their ears straining to catch each word. Outside, Paris bustled with life, with politics, with gossip. Inside, in that hall, time seemed to slow, all attention drawn to the frail figure who spoke with the authority of lived truth. And yet, even in triumph, her body betrayed her. She left the lecture hall each day exhausted, her steps slow, her breath shallow. She returned home pale, sometimes collapsing into her chair, too weary even to speak. Her daughters watched with worry, urging her to rest, but she seldom listened. To her, rest was indulgence, and indulgence was foreign. She had carried herself through hunger and exile, through grief and scandal, through war and fame. Why should frailty now persuade her to stop? Still, she was not blind to her condition. She knew that her body was failing, though she did not fully name the cause. Radiation was not yet understood as poison, though she must have suspected it. Her eyesight dimmed, her strength waned, her blood weakened. She pressed on regardless, her lectures continuing, her notebooks filling, her experiments enduring. For her, to cease would have been to betray not only herself, but also the path she had walked for decades, the path she believed must not end with silence. Her students remembered her not only for her lectures, but for her presence. They recalled the severity of her gaze, the dignity of her posture, the way she seemed both fragile and unbreakable at once. They spoke of her not as a performer, but as a living testament to endurance, a figure who embodied the very principles she taught. Some found inspiration, others found awe, but none left unmoved. For in her presence they glimpsed not only the mysteries of science, but the mysteries of devotion, the strange beauty of a life given wholly to truth. One evening, after a lecture, she remained in the empty hall for a moment longer than usual. The students had left, their footsteps echoing into silence, the blackboard still covered in chalked equations. She stood alone before it, her hand resting lightly on the lectern. The air was quiet, the dust of chalk shimmering faintly in the dim light. She gazed at the board, at the lines she had written, and for a moment she seemed to see not only equations, but memories. The attic in Paris, the shed with Pierre, the lectures he had once given before she had taken his place. She closed her eyes, weary, and breathed deeply. Then she turned, her steps slow, and left the hall in silence. The chalk dust remained, glowing faintly as the light faded. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Inside, the hall stood empty, yet heavy with the echo of her voice, the memory of her presence. The dust would be wiped away, the board cleared, the hall filled again. But the impression of that moment, of that frail figure standing before equations, lingered in the air like a shadow of eternity. The chalk dust lingered faintly on the blackboard after she left the lecture hall, a pale trace of words and numbers that had flowed from her hand. In the quiet, it glowed almost like a shadow of the light she had once coaxed from radium, fragile yet enduring. And as she stepped into the night air, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the stone corridors of the Sorbonne, she carried with her not only the weariness of the day, but the weight of memories that never ceased to accompany her. For though she had lectured before countless students, though she had carried honors across nations, though she had endured war and scandal, the presence of Pierre had never left her. His death, sudden and brutal, had taken place decades earlier. Yet grief does not obey the laws of time. It lingers like a shadow, sometimes faint, sometimes sharp, but always there. In the quiet of her study, she kept his photograph near, his gaze frozen in stillness, his presence reduced to an image framed in silence. She would glance at it while she worked, her eyes meeting his across the gulf of years, as though to remind herself that the work she continued was still theirs, even if his hands no longer turned the pages or lifted the vials. She did not speak of grief often. Her daughters knew, her colleagues suspected, but Marie seldom gave words to the emptiness she carried. She was a woman of silence, a woman of endurance, a woman who bore her wounds without display. Yet silence itself spoke. The absence of laughter, the severity of her dress, the austerity of her home, all were signs of a sorrow that had never fully softened. She had worn black since Pierre's death, not as a temporary mark of mourning, but as a permanent garment, a uniform of memory. Her figure in lecture halls, always clad in dark severity, was not only a choice of modesty, but a testimony of loyalty, a visible echo of grief carried into every public space. At times, when she sat alone in her laboratory, she thought of him as he had been in those early days, the quiet man with eyes full of thought, his presence steady, his devotion as unadorned as hers. She remembered their bicycles in the countryside, the simplicity of their wedding, the long hours of shared labor in the damp shed. She remembered his voice, his hand passing her an instrument, his brow furrowed over calculations. These memories came not as bright recollections, but as dim lanterns, flickering in the fog of time. They were both comfort and wound, both gift and torment. Her notebooks from later years sometimes carried traces of this grief. Between lines of equations and calculations, there were pauses, empty spaces, as though her pen had faltered. Did she see his hand in hers as she wrote? Did she hear his voice in the silence of the laboratory? She never confessed such things aloud, but grief often finds expression in silence more eloquent than in words. The world knew her as Marie Curie, laureate, pioneer, professor, but within she remained Maria Skłodowska, widow of Pierre, still bound to the memory of the man who had walked beside her. She lived in forward motion, yet always tethered to the past. Every honor she received, she accepted alone. But in her mind, she must have shared it with him. Every lecture she gave, every student she taught, every paper she wrote, she must have felt him standing invisibly at her side, the absent companion who had once been her equal in discovery. There is a particular loneliness in such enduring grief. For those who lose companions in old age, time itself softens the wound, the years shared outweighing the years lost. But for Marie, the loss had come early, abrupt, cruel, when both were still in the prime of their work, their love, their partnership. The decades that followed were not filled with shared age, but with solitary endurance. She lived on, not for herself alone, but for both of them, carrying their vision, their work, their devotion. Yet no matter how far she went, no matter what honors she achieved, Pierre remained absent, and absence can be as heavy as presence. One evening, after returning from the Sorbonne, she sat at her desk, her body weary, her eyes dim. The vials glowed faintly on the shelves, their light pale and indifferent. She opened a drawer and took out a small photograph of Pierre, his face young, his gaze solemn. She placed it on the desk before her, beside her papers, beside her trembling hand. For a long time she sat in silence, her eyes fixed upon the image. Outside, Paris moved with its usual rhythm, the sound of footsteps, the rattle of carriages, the hum of voices. Inside, there was only her in the photograph, the glow of radium casting shadows across his face, across hers. Did she speak to him then? Did she whisper words of fatigue, of triumph, of loneliness? Or did she sit in silence, allowing the presence of the image to stand in place of words? We cannot know, but we can imagine the weight of that moment. A woman who had given the world new elements, who had twice been crowned by Nobel honors, who had lectured in halls once closed to her sex, sitting alone in the pale light of radium, her gaze resting upon the face of the man who had once walked beside her. The glow on the shelves remained steady, indifferent to memory, indifferent to love, indifferent to grief. It was eternal. He was not. She was not. Yet in that glow, she must have felt the echo of their shared days, the silent presence of a love cut short, yet never extinguished. The night deepened. She placed the photograph gently back into the drawer, her hand lingering for a moment on its frame. She closed the drawer softly, as though not to disturb the silence, and turned back to her papers. The glow illuminated the wavering lines of her handwriting, the fragile testament of a woman enduring both time and loss. The drawer closed softly, the photograph of Pierre hidden once more in silence, though never absent from her thoughts. The vials on the shelves glowed faintly, indifferent to memory, indifferent to grief. Their light was steady, eternal, while hers flickered and waned with the fatigue of her body. And yet beyond the small circle of her study, the world called her name more insistently than ever. Nations honored her, societies praised her, students revered her. Fame pressed upon her with a weight as heavy as loneliness, for she stood now at the paradox of her life, celebrated by millions, yet profoundly alone. By the 1920s, Marie Curie had become more than a scientist. She was a symbol. To some, she represented the triumph of perseverance. To others, the power of intellect over prejudice. To others, still the embodiment of sacrifice for knowledge. Her image appeared in newspapers, in speeches, in textbooks. Crowds applauded her presence. Audiences rose to their feet when she entered a hall. Yet she never sought the applause, never lingered in its warmth. She accepted it as one accepts weather, uncontrollable, passing, indifferent to one's true state. Behind the honors, she remained the same, a woman bent over her desk, frail, weary, scribbling notes under the pale glow of radium. The solitude of fame is different from the solitude of obscurity. In youth, her isolation had been born of poverty and exile, her hunger unknown, her brilliance unseen. Now her solitude was paradoxical. She was surrounded by admiration, yet untouched by intimacy. Crowds knew her name, but not her heart. Nations celebrated her work, but did not ease her weariness. She had become, in many eyes, less a person than an icon, and icons are revered but not embraced. Her students at the Sorbonne watched her with awe, but seldom with familiarity. Her colleagues respected her, but few dared to draw close. Her daughters loved her, but even they saw her more often through the veil of fatigue than through the ease of companionship. Marie herself did little to dissolve these distances. She wore her severity as both armor and burden. She spoke little of herself, revealed little of her thoughts beyond science. The silence she had cultivated since childhood remained her refuge, though it was also her prison. It is haunting to imagine the evenings after great ceremonies, when medals were placed in her hands, when crowds applauded her name, when journalists clamored for her image. She would return home, her figure small and weary, her gown dark, her steps slow. She would place the medals quietly in a drawer, sit at her desk, open her notebooks, and resume her work. The applause still rang in the streets, but in her study there was only silence, the faint scratch of her pen, the steady glow of radium. For her, the essence of life was not the honor but the endurance, not the recognition but the truth. And yet there must have been moments when loneliness pressed upon her more deeply than usual. To have known companionship so profound with Pierre and to live decades without it was to carry an emptiness no medal could fill, to be exalted as a figure of progress, yet to eat her meals alone, to walk home in silence, to rest her head on a pillow without another presence beside her. This was the paradox she endured. Genius does not shield against solitude. Fame does not soothe the ache of absence. Her notebooks reveal none of this directly. They remain austere, filled with numbers and observations, the handwriting growing weaker with time, but never indulging in sentiment. Yet silence speaks in ways louder than words. The absence of confession is itself a confession. The very severity of her pages tells us that she carried her solitude without sharing it, bore it as she bore illness, as she bore grief, as she bore labor, with silence, with endurance, with unyielding dignity. The world around her shifted. Younger scientists, some of them her own students, advanced the theories of the atom, moved into realms of quantum and relativity, spoke of energies she had helped reveal but never fully pursued. She watched this with quiet pride, though also perhaps with a sense of estrangement. She had opened the door, but others now rushed through it. She was celebrated as a pioneer, yet pioneers often find themselves left on the threshold, watching the path they cleared, filled with footsteps that pass them by. It is the nature of progress, to revere its origin, yet to leave it behind. Still, her presence was sought. Nations invited her to ceremonies. Societies crowned her with honors. Journalists followed her movements. She accepted these roles with grace, but always with reserve. She never became comfortable with fame, never sought its warmth. It sat upon her shoulders like a cloak too heavy, useful only in winter but suffocating in its weight. She endured it as she endured every burden. One evening, after a public celebration, she returned once more to her study. The room was quiet, her daughters asleep, the city outside murmuring faintly. She removed the gown she had worn, folded it with care, and placed it aside. She opened the drawer, placed the newest medal inside beside the others, closed it softly. Then she sat at her desk, her pen trembling in her hand, her notebook spread before her. The vials on the shelves glowed faintly, casting their steady light across her face. She began to write again, her words uneven, her breath shallow. Outside, the world knew her as a symbol of greatness, celebrated across nations. Inside, she was only a woman in solitude, frail, weary, enduring. Fame had not erased loneliness. Recognition had not softened grief. Applause had not eased the ache of her body. The glow of radium remained steady, indifferent to honors, indifferent to absence, indifferent to solitude. And in that indifference lay both her comfort and her sorrow. The night deepened. Her pen slipped from her fingers, clattering softly upon the desk. She closed her eyes, her breath shallow, her face illuminated by the pale glow on the shelves. Outside, crowds still spoke her name. Inside, silence prevailed. The pen slipped from her hand and struck the desk with a soft sound, almost swallowed by the silence of the room. The vials glowed faintly on the shelves, steady and pale, indifferent to the frailty of the hand that had once drawn their light from stone. Outside, the voices of admiration still carried her name across nations, but inside, her breath came shallow, her strength waned, and her body faltered. Fame could not hold back decline. Honors could not soothe the marrow that had been quietly unraveling for decades. The light she had given to the world now consumed her, and the time had come for her to withdraw not only from her laboratory, but from life itself. By the early 1930s, her health had deteriorated beyond denial. Her sight, once sharp enough to discern the faintest glow in a darkened shed, dimmed to blurred shadows. Her skin, once marked only by labor, bore sores that refused to heal. Her blood, once steady, grew frail, anemia weakening her to the point where even walking left her breathless. Her daughters and colleagues urged her to rest, to cease the work that had consumed her, but she remained reluctant. To her, rest was not a reprieve, but a surrender. She had lived in labor. She could not imagine living otherwise. And yet, even she could not resist the failing of her body. She was taken to a sanatorium in the village of Passy, nestled in the French Alps. There, among the mountains, the air was clear and cool, filled with the scent of pine, the sound of wind moving through branches, the distant toll of church bells echoing against the stone valleys. It was a place meant for healing, for recovery. Yet she did not come to recover. She came to wait. The invisible wounds she carried could not be undone, for they were woven too deeply into her blood, her bones, her very breath. The sanatorium was quiet, its rooms austere, its corridors hushed. She lay upon pale sheets, her body thin, her face drawn, her eyes clouded but still sharp with thought. Doctors came and went, their words respectful, their treatments gentle but futile. They spoke of aplastic anemia, though even then the full truth of radiation's effects was not understood. They treated symptoms, but the cause was beyond their reach. Marie, who had uncovered forces deeper than the atom, now lay helpless before them. She endured their care as she endured all else, with silence, with dignity, with endurance. Her daughters visited, their presence both comfort and sorrow. Iran, devoted to science as her mother had been, spoke of experiments, of discoveries, of work that continued. Ev, devoted to art and memory, spoke softly of the world beyond laboratories, of music, of words. They sat by her bed, holding her hands, their faces etched with worry. She looked at them with tenderness, pride, and perhaps also apology, for she had given them not only life but the burden of her legacy, the weight of her example, the shadow of her sacrifice. The days passed slowly, marked not by discoveries or lectures but by the movement of light across the walls, by the soft tread of nurses, by the quiet rhythm of breathing that grew weaker with each passing week. She lay often in silence, her thoughts turned inward. Did she reflect upon her life, upon the journey from Warsaw to Paris, from hunger to honors, from obscurity to fame? Did she think of her mother lost in childhood, her sister taken too soon, her father teaching with broken instruments, her secret studies in Warsaw's hidden schools? Did she remember Pierre, his voice, his presence, his sudden absence? Or did she think only of the glow, the strange and terrible beauty that had shaped her life and was now consuming it? The mountains outside stood eternal, their peaks dusted with snow even in summer, their valleys echoing with the calls of birds, the rustle of pines. From her window she could see them, their vastness indifferent yet comforting. They had stood long before her, they would stand long after her. Perhaps in their silence she found kinship, for she too had lived in silence, in endurance, in the steady pursuit of truths larger than herself. There were nights when the pain pressed harder, when her breath came ragged, when her body trembled with weakness. Yet even then she seldom cried out. She endured as she always had, with quiet fortitude. Nurses whispered of her severity, of her calm, of her refusal to complain. To them, she seemed not a patient, but a presence, a figure who bore suffering as naturally as she bore honor. One evening, as twilight deepened over the mountains, she lay in her bed, her daughters near, the air cool and still. The bells of a distant church tolled softly, their sound carried on the wind, fading into silence. She closed her eyes, her face pale, her breath shallow. Her daughters held her hands, their own trembling, their eyes filled with tears. For a moment the world seemed to pause, the mountain still, the pines quiet, the bells silent. Then her breath ceased, and with it, a life that had given the world both light and shadow, both triumph and tragedy. Marie Curie died on the 4th of July, 1934, in that quiet sanatorium in Passy. The cause was recorded as aplastic anemia, the slow unraveling of her blood. But those who understood knew it was something else, something deeper, the gift and curse of radiation, the invisible rays that had illuminated the hidden world and consumed the body that revealed them. She died not as a victim, but as a witness, her life both a discovery and a warning, her endurance both an inspiration and a caution. In her room after her passing, the sheets were straightened, the windows opened to let in the mountain air. The bells tolled again, their sound drifting across valleys, carrying with them the echo of her departure. The mountains remained, silent and eternal, indifferent as the vials that still glowed faintly in her laboratory far away. Her body was gone, her breath ceased, but her light, like theirs, remained. The night deepened over the Alps, stars scattered across the sky, glowing, steady, and indifferent. In Paris, in Warsaw, in Stockholm, her name lingered in whispers, in lectures, in memories. She had lived, she had endured, she had given light, and she had borne its shadow. The glow she had uncovered would continue, long after her, steady, eternal, indifferent. The mountains stood silent after her breath ceased, their slopes and valleys indifferent to the life that had ended beneath their gaze. The bells tolled through the clear air, their echoes fading into the distance, like the final vibrations of a string that had been plucked and then left to silence. In the sanatorium, her body lay still upon pale sheets, no longer trembling, no longer struggling, no longer bearing the burden of endurance. The woman who had coaxed light from the darkness of stone, who had walked through hunger, grief, scandal, and war, now lay in stillness, her eyes closed forever. Yet death is never only an end. It is also a procession of remembrance, a gathering of the living to mark the passage of the one who is gone. Her daughters, Irene and Eve, bore their grief with the quiet dignity that she herself had taught them. Irene, scientist and daughter of radium, knew the cause of death more clearly than any physician's record could declare. Eve, with her artist's heart, saw the poetry of a life that had burned like a candle, consuming itself to give light. Together they stood in silence, their faces pale, their hearts heavy, their eyes filled with both sorrow and pride. For they had been shaped by her, raised in the shadow of her sacrifice, and now they carried forward not only her memory, but her burden. The body of Marie Curie was carried from the sanatorium to Paris, through streets where once she had walked in hunger as a student, where once she had labored in obscurity, where once she had stood in triumph and in scandal. The city watched her pass in silence now, its crowds gathered not to jeer nor to cheer, but to bear witness. For whatever judgment had once been cast upon her, now only reverence remained. She was no longer a subject of gossip nor even of fame. She was a figure passing into memory, into history, into the silence that swallows all names in time, yet preserves a few in eternity. She was buried beside Pierre in the cemetery of Sceaux, south of Paris, the town where the Curie family had often walked, where Pierre's parents had lived, where once there had been laughter, companionship, bicycles in the countryside. Now it was the resting place of both husband and wife, reunited at last beneath the soil. The earth closed over them, heavy and final, the sound of soil falling upon wood, echoing in the ears of those who stood in mourning. Friends, colleagues, and strangers gathered, their heads bowed, their voices hushed. There were no crowds shouting, no journalists scribbling scandal, no applause of ceremonies, only silence, only dust, only the quiet recognition that a life of endurance had come to rest. The grave was simple, as she had been. No ornament, no extravagance, no display. Only a marker, only earth, only silence. Yet within that silence lay the weight of her journey. From Warsaw's secret classrooms to Paris's lecture halls, from the damp shed where radium first glowed to the battlefields where X-rays saved the wounded, from the halls of Stockholm to the streets of scandal, from triumph to decline, from light to shadow. Now all was dust, and yet dust is never only an end. It is also memory, also soil, also seed. Those who stood at her grave must have wondered what legacy she left behind. Was it the medals, heavy and inert, locked in drawers? Was it the glowing notebooks, too dangerous to touch, their ink still trembling with her hand? Was it the daughters, one to continue in science, one to preserve in words? Or was it something larger, something invisible, something that could not be buried in schools? Perhaps her legacy was the very idea that truth, however costly, is worth seeking, that light, even when it destroys, is still light. The soil pressed down, the grave closed, the mourners departed. The cemetery fell silent again, its trees whispering in the wind, its stones weathered by rain and time. Beneath the earth lay Pierre and Marie, their bodies returned to dust, their names already carved into the stone of history. Above them, the sky stretched pale, indifferent, eternal. But radium still glowed in laboratories across the world. Students still opened her books. Doctors still used X-rays to heal the wounded. Her name lingered not only in speeches and in journals, but in the very air of progress. And so the grave, though final in earth, was not final in memory. One evening, long after the burial, a visitor to Sceaux might have walked the cemetery paths, the air quiet, the trees bending in the wind. At the grave of Pierre and Marie Curie, the stone lay still, the earth settled. Yet in the silence, one might have felt something more, a presence not of bodies, but of endurance, of sacrifice, of light born from darkness. The soil held them, but the world still carried their fire. Dust settled upon the stone. Leaves fell upon the ground. The seasons turned as they always do. The grave remained, silent, heavy, closed. Yet within the earth lay not only death, but memory, and memory is never fully silent. The grave at Sceaux lay quiet beneath its covering of soil, the air above it moving gently through the trees, the silence of the cemetery broken only by the occasional step of a visitor or the whisper of leaves in the wind. For decades, Pierre and Marie Curie rested there side by side, their names carved into stone, their memory carried in the minds of those who passed. Yet history does not always leave its figures in silence. Some lives, once finished, continue to move, continue to be claimed, continue to be summoned from the earth into the halls of remembrance. So it was with Marie Curie, whose remains would not remain in Sceaux, but would one day be carried into the Pantheon of Paris, to lie among the honored dead of France. In 1995, more than 60 years after her death, the French Republic chose to transfer her and Pierre to that monumental resting place, where Voltaire, Rousseau, Victor Hugo, and Zola already lay. It was an act not of burial, but of elevation, a recognition that their lives were not merely personal stories, but part of the collective memory of a nation. The bodies were exhumed with ceremony, carried through the streets, and placed in coffins of lead. The reason was not only honor, but necessity. For even in death, Marie's body remained touched by the forces she had unveiled. The very bones she had carried to exhaustion were still radioactive, still glowing invisibly with the remnants of radium. She had given herself so fully to science that even her grave could not silence her discoveries. The Pantheon, with its massive columns and its dome rising above Paris, received her in solemn procession. Crowds gathered in silence, the air heavy with both reverence and reflection. For the first time, a woman entered those crypts, not as the companion of a man, not as an ornament of another's legacy, but in her own right, for her own work, her own endurance, her own truth. Marie Curie became the first woman to be interred there on merit alone, a gesture that seemed to repair, in death, the neglect she had endured in life. Yet such honors, however grand, could not erase the cost she had paid, nor the suffering she had endured. Her legacy lived not only in the stone of the Pantheon, nor in the medals preserved in museums, but also in the fragile pages of her notebooks, still so saturated with radiation that they cannot be touched without protection. To open them even now is to handle danger, to confront the paradox of her life, knowledge that illuminates yet destroys, discoveries that heal yet consume. The ink still bears her hand, trembling in the later years, sharp in the earlier ones. The numbers and observations remain, silent and precise, but they are surrounded by a glow invisible, a whisper of energy that endures long after her breath ceased. Her very words are untouchable, her very records poisonous, as though to remind us that truth is never without cost. Visitors to libraries and archives may still see them, encased, sealed, resting in protective coverings. They appear fragile, ordinary, sheets of paper filled with lines and notes, and yet they radiate power, not only the power of science, but the power of sacrifice. They testify that discovery is never free, that progress demands flesh, blood, time, and sometimes life itself. To gaze upon them is to feel both awe and unease, both gratitude and sorrow. They are relics not of sanctity but of struggle, relics of a woman who gave herself so fully that even her memory glows with peril. What, then, is her legacy? Is it the medals and honors, heavy with gold but silent in their drawers? Is it the Pantheon where her name lies among France's immortals? Is it the notebooks, dangerous and luminous, trembling with her hand? Or is it something more subtle, something less easily touched? Perhaps her true legacy lies in the questions she left us, in the paradox she embodied, in the ambiguity of light itself. For she revealed that matter holds within it hidden fire, that the atom is not silent, but alive with unseen forces. She revealed that science can illuminate the body, heal the wounded, save lives. But she also revealed unwillingly that the same forces can wound, can poison, can destroy. She revealed that truth is radiant, but that radiance burns. She revealed that discovery and suffering are often inseparable, that to touch the stars is also to bear their fire. And beyond science, she revealed something even more enduring, that endurance itself is a form of greatness. She endured hunger, exile, grief, scandal, illness, loneliness. She endured the suspicion of colleagues, the cruelty of crowds, the frailty of her body. She endured without adornment, without complaint, without surrender. In her silence lay her strength. In her austerity lay her devotion. In her endurance lay her legacy. One imagines her now, not beneath the dome of the Pantheon, not within the lead-lined coffin, not in the sealed notebooks. One imagines her in a quiet laboratory, bending over a vial that glows faintly in the dark. Her face is pale, her hands tremble, her eyes are shadowed with fatigue. Yet she gazes at the glow with awe, with devotion, with resolve. She sees not danger but truth, not peril but promise. She does not turn away. She never turned away. The vial glows still, pale and steady, indifferent to her absence, indifferent to her presence. It glowed in the shed, in the lecture hall, in the study, in the sanatorium. It glows now in memory, in history, in legend. It is both her triumph and her tragedy, both her gift and her curse. It is her legacy, her warning, her question. Does light reveal or does it destroy? Does it illuminate the path forward or consume those who bear it? Can one separate truth from suffering, discovery from sacrifice? These questions linger, unanswered, in the pale glow that she left behind. The night deepens over Paris. The dome of the Pantheon rises against the sky, its stones heavy with the names of the honored dead. Inside, in the crypt, lies Marie Curie, beside Pierre, their bodies sealed in lead, their names carved in stone. Above them, the city moves, the streets echo with life, the river flows. Around them, the world continues, filled with lights that burn and fade. And in memory, her vial glows still, eternal, indifferent, asking us quietly whether light is blessing or curse, gift or burden, triumph or tragedy. The glow lingers, pale and eternal. She is gone. Yet the question remains.